Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Cabbage Head Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Had Nightmare Control Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku rested his chin on the palm of his hand, elbow pressed into his desk as he allowed his mind to wander. The green curls tickled his ears each time he moved his head, whispers creeping into his thoughts. It would have been suffocating if he cared much. Their disgust was palpable. Even with all their differences, everyone in his school had something in common. They all hated Izuku Midoriya. He didn't let it bother him. In fact, his mind was focused on something entirely different. Something more important than anything going on around him. What was he going to have for dinner? But alas, his dinner thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his teacher walking into the classroom, lightly tossing the door closed behind him as he moved towards his desk. As the man situated himself behind said desk, Izuku lazily moved his attention towards the front, letting out a slight sigh as he snapped his mind from his daydreams. After a moment, his teacher straightened himself, taking a few minutes to bring the rest of the class attention towards him. Izuku raised a brow as his attempts repeatedly resulted in failure, with half of the class talking over the man as he became increasingly frustrated. Once a few minutes had passed, the freckled boy sat upwards, raising his hand and, slowly but surely, all eyes moved towards him. "I think the teacher's trying to say something," he said in a monotone voice. The teacher awkwardly cleared his throat. "Yes. Thank you, Midoriya." Izuku ignored the man's clear nervousness, instead opting to toss him a simple nod, though his head only moved by a fraction. "Anyways, class." The teacher brightened, eyes only occasionally flickering towards the freckled boy. "As third-year students, it's time to start thinking seriously about your futures and what you want to do with your lives." Izuku sighed, knowing what was coming despite the irrationality of it all. "We can't all be heroes," he mumbled, though nobody bothered to pay him any attention. "I could pass out some career aptitude test." His teacher smirked, leaning towards the class. "But why bother?" He grinned, tossing the papers into the air, leaving Izuku to watch as they fluttered towards the ground, dancing in the air before sliding around the room as they touched the ground. "I know you all want to go to the hero track." The freckled boy's jaw tensed as he watched all of his classmates cheer and showcase their abilities. Most of them, he had noted before, didn't have quirks that were useful in any way. Which is probably why fear clouded within the room. Fear of not being good enough. Fear of failing the tests. Fear of being stuck in a dead-end job for the rest of their lives. Needless to say, it was quite gloomy despite the fact that it was all covered up by the students' plastered-on smiles and cheerful hollering. "Yes, yes," the teacher continued, eyes flickering towards some students with half-useless quirks with a slight tenseness in his eyes. "You've all got some very impressive quirks. But no power usage allowed at school. Get a hold of yourselves." "Hey teach," a voice chimed in, Izuku's eyes already having dragged themselves to none other than Katsuki Bakugo. "Don't lump me in with this bunch of losers. I'm the real deal, but these guys will be lucky to end up as sidekicks to some busted D-lister." He laughed mockingly. Although Izuku was less than impressed by the boy's clear arrogance, he wasn't wrong. So, against his better judgment, he chose not to say anything. "You think you're better than us, Katsuki?" The class raged, earning a laugh from the blonde. Bakugo grinned. "Let's go. I'll take you all on." "Huh." The teacher caught the class attention, reading over Bakugo's file. How he picked it up out of all the scattered papers, Izuku had no idea. "Maybe you will get into UA High." Izuku's nose scrunched at the announcement of Bakugo's choice school. Not only had he given out a small bit of personal information, not that his grades were really hidden considering his chart-topping scores, but it was unprofessional nonetheless, but it had also been Izuku's choice in school. Which meant that he couldn't avoid being called out. Wonderful. The freckled boy resigned himself to his fate, simply waiting as surprised whispers circled around the room. "Wait, he's gonna try for the national school? That school has a 0.2% acceptance rate. It's impossible to get into." Bakugo grinned, leaping onto his desk as he pointed his thumb towards himself. That's exactly why it's the only place worthy of me. I aced all the mock tests. I'm the only one at this school who stands a chance at getting in. Izuku pondered his last proclamation for a moment, glancing around his classroom before nodding to himself. I'll end up more popular than All Might himself. Izuku raised a brow. Well, maybe not that popular. Of course, Bakugo couldn't actually hear his thoughts. Or maybe he could, considering the slight turn of his head and the tiniest of glares pointed towards the freckled boy, and clenched his fist with an even wider grin. I'll be the richest hero of all time. People all over the world will know who I am. And it all starts with UA High. Oh yeah, Midoriya, his teacher said suddenly, causing Izuku to let out a small sigh in preparation for his verbal lashing. Don't you want to get into UA too? The majority of the class visibly stiffened, causing even more whispers to circulate around the room. Him? No way. Someone whisper shouted. Probably to get information on the heroes or something, another said nastily. There's no way he can be anything other than a villain. Bakugo's eye flicked towards Izuku, but he took back his glance before the boy had any time to think about it, instead choosing to ignore everyone's judging stares. Yes, Izuku answered simply, eyes lazily wandering the room and causing each person who was caught in his sight to shift nervously. His teacher hummed in reply, not bothering to look at the boy. Well, good luck then. Izuku didn't attempt to reply, knowing that the teacher most definitely didn't want to continue their little conversation, even though he was the one who brought it upon himself. For the last remaining moments of the class, it was entirely silent, only broken by the sudden sound of the bell. Several sighs of relief went around the room, mumbling about Izuku. He, of course, didn't care as they left, barely noticing that tension in the first place. No way! Bakugo growled, shooting up from his seat. The blonde shot Izuku a glare as he walked up to his desk, shoving his finger in the boy's face. Listen, that. You're even worse than the rest of these rejects. He glared at him, letting loose a slight snarl before practically spitting in his face. What makes you think they'd choose someone like you, he spat, over someone like me? Izuku simply blinked at the blonde before pushing his finger down. Maybe we'll both get in. Bakugo twitched angrily, but unlike everyone else, he didn't stiffen at Izuku's touch. He began to open his mouth to continue berating the boy, but was interrupted by the boy to his side. What is this? He asked curiously. He turned the notebook in his hand, causing Izuku's eyes to travel downwards to discover that his notebook was no longer on his desk. The boy then chuckled, raising an amused brow at Izuku. Seriously? A hero analysis notebook? Bakugo's other friend suddenly snorted. You're kidding, right? I thought he couldn't get any more suspicious. He turned towards Izuku, sneering. What are you trying to do? Gather info on the heroes so you can take them down later on. Izuku simply blinked, definitely not providing the reaction that the boy opposite him was looking for. After a moment, he turned towards the boy that held his book and held out his hand. Give it back. The boy looked taken aback, but he was quickly relieved of the awkwardness when Bakugo snatched the book from his hand. I thought you couldn't get any more pathetic, he said, rolling his eyes. After a moment, he glanced up at Izuku, practically throwing the book back in his face. He then turned as the notebook fell into the freckled boy's lap, sighing as he walked towards the door. I don't get why you haven't given up yet, Deku. You're just wasting your time. His friends walked out the door, waiting for him when Bakugo suddenly paused. Nobody will ever want to be saved by a creep like you. After a moment of silence, Bakugo rolled his eyes and walked out the door, hands in his pockets. Dude, what was that all about? One of his friends asked, raising a brow. Bakugo shook his head. Just shut it, stretch. Once Izuku heard as the three made it down the hall, he looked down at the notebook in his lap. He carefully flipped the notebook open, staring at a page with a creased corner. Scribbled roughly in the middle was a simple message from Bakugo, one that he had likely written while his friends were looking away. Try all you want, Deku. I'll still beat you. Izuku's lips slightly twitched. The boy then sighed, closing the book and sliding it into his backpack. After knowing Bakugo for many years, he still didn't know how to figure the blonde out. Still, he knew at least one thing. Bakugo wasn't afraid of him like everyone else. No, it was simpler than that. That much was easy to figure out. The blonde felt nothing more than pure, unadulterated hatred towards him. He just didn't understand why. Scrolling through his phone, Izuku caught sight of the morning news. He blinked as he remembered the incident he had seen before, one in which some sort of purse snatcher had blocked traffic after transforming with his quirk. Izuku had been interested in staying, but had already been running late for school, so instead took an alternate route, which, by the way, wasn't too far, so it was relatively confusing as to why nobody else bothered to try it. The boy mumbled to himself about the incident, attempting to create the picture in his mind, scanning through the series of pictures in order to recreate it better. This would be much easier with a video, he thought absent-mindedly, but continued nonetheless. In the end, he ended up with a few extra notes for already sketched heroes as well as a new page for Mount Lady. Not too shabby. After putting his notebook back into his backpack, he stood from the curb and stuffed his earbuds into his pockets, seriously regretting the decision once he realized that he'd no doubt have to untangle them later, before walking towards the tunnel that led him back home. However, just as he entered, he felt an awful sensation overtake him. It wasn't his fear, of course, but it seeped into his senses. Izuku cautiously stepped forwards, receiving the full brunt of the feeling as he stood before the sewer grate. His stomach churned as a cloud of dread rose from the grate, followed by a slightly worrying shaking sound. Of the grate, which, if Izuku had his physics and such right, didn't usually shake. Stepping backwards after his wondrous realization, Izuku watched as sludge oozed from the gate, pulling itself into a messy heap before forming into a sort of monster. The slime continued dripping downwards, revealing sharp fangs and a wide set of teeth, along with huge, yellow eyes. Izuku blinked at the situation, already sick of it before it even started. Still, before he could even attempt to leave, the sludge monster grinned, baring his teeth as his vision centered on the boy. "You'll make the perfect skin suit for me to hide in, kid?" "I'd rather not," Izuku mumbled, leaping away from the monster's attack and causing him to look over confusedly. After a moment, however, the villain grinned. "Great, you're not totally worthless after all. This'll be much better for me then," he gurgled, letting out an ominous chuckle. Before Izuku could move the second time, he realized that the monster's sludge was wrapped around his ankle, causing the boy to stumble slightly. He gritted his teeth as he attempted to pull his leg loose and, with a slight splash, he broke free. Unfortunately for him, the sludge monster had already begun to work on moving towards his other leg, forcing his sludge to travel up much quicker than before. "Not too bad, kid," the villain laughed once again, "but in the end, you can't win." Izuku had no time to protest as the sludge encompassed him, helplessly watching as the tips of his fingers were covered. The freckled boy narrowed his eyes, practically the only thing visible, and tried to keep himself from choking on the sludge as he raised his hands, all the while barely able to break them free as he grasped at the slime. "Grab all you want," the sludge villain grinned. "It's no use anyway. My body is made of fluid. It'll be easier for both of us if you don't fight back." His eyes just barely flicked towards the side as he lowered his voice. "Too bad we're stuck in this mess. If I had known he was in the city." Although Izuku felt as if his lungs were burning, his mind briefly pondered the comment. It almost seemed like the sludge monster was. Squeezing his eyes shut, the boy stopped moving entirely, forcing himself to focus entirely on his thoughts. He didn't have much, but it was enough. The villain laughed. "You're a real hero to me, kid." Izuku instinctively gritted his teeth, searching. He just had to keep looking. The boy's eyes suddenly opened, a purplish smoke coiling around his wrists before leaving through his fingertips and flowing through the sludge. "The hell?" the sludge villain mumbled. Slowly but surely, Izuku directed his quirk, which, of course, was only made more difficult due to the fact that his vision was almost completely blurred. Nevertheless, he twirled it around before finally finding the sewer grate before forcing the smoke to travel downwards. As the smoke drifted away, Izuku found it more difficult to breathe. He was weakening and fast. But just when he was about to fall limp, he felt a new surge of emotion near him. Without bothering to think, the boy forced his smoke forwards in a rush, circling it around a figure. He felt muscles stiffen, the touch of skin sending a shock to Izuku back through the smoke. And as soon as he had the man's attention, he began to pull the smoke back, ignoring the screaming of his lungs and dimming of his vision. "Knock it off, brat," the sludge monster growled, shoving Izuku just enough to cause the smoke to disappear. Izuku's jaw just barely clenched, unable to hold up the strength for more than a moment. I have to become a hero. Yes, he heard the monster curse, causing the boy's eyes to flutter. His eyes dragged themselves to the left where they fell upon a shadowed figure. "Fear not," his voice boomed. "Now that I am here, that is." Wind slammed into his body and, ignoring the thrumming pain underneath his skin, Izuku gasped for air, fingers twitching to his neck as he fell to the ground. He hissed slightly as his skin skidded against the asphalt, but found himself more preoccupied with greedily gulping as much air as he could handle. "Might," he whispered breathlessly, barely able to see the shadow of the man towering over him as his vision became black. The snickering of children filled Izuku's eardrums as he took in a breath. "What a freak, Deku," they sneered. Izuku grabbed onto his shirt. "I can feel your heart's pumping. Why don't you try doing something with a little passion?" his teacher suggested, trying to appear kind. He could hear the tone of their voice. They were afraid. "I can hear your rapid breaths. You shouldn't even be alive," a boy spat, his narrowed eyes trailing up Izuku's body, only pausing as they settled on the boy's face. "I can see your body twitch with fear." "Heartless creep," he heard a girl mumble to her friend. "And I can create your worst nightmares." "Why is he even here?" a girl whispered under her breath. "He's going to be a villain one day, anyway." As soon as her eyes met with Izuku's, she froze, immediately looking away as she bit her lip. "I don't want to." Izuku extended his hand out to Bakugo, ignoring the wet cloth pressing against his legs. "Are you okay?" he asked, tilting his head. "I can help." The blonde's nose scrunched up, eyes narrowing as he slapped away Izuku's hand. The boy straightened slightly, but displayed no other form of emotion. After the display, Bakugo seemed especially angry. "I don't need any help from you," he hissed, venom in his tone. "I just want to help." Izuku glanced over, a boy's cries catching his attention. With an added sense of urgency at the billowing sadness that seemed to escape from the boy's skin, he quickly walked over, eyes trailing upwards until they fell upon a colorful kite caught in between leafy branches. With a slight smile to reassure the boy, Izuku lifted his finger, twirling purple smoke from around his fingertip before it began to branch out. The little boy's eyes widened as the shape grew and formed into a beast, showcasing a mixture of fear and curiosity. Izuku didn't seem to notice, however, continuing to allow the smoke to grow and morph into a beast before sending it to fetch the kite. The violet beast leapt onto the tree, using its claws to climb until it could reach the toy. After clamping down its teeth, the beast dropped from the tree before dropping it down at the boy's feet. Izuku, grateful, pet the beast as it dissipated before turning towards the boy, brows furrowing as he watched his skin pale and breaths quicken. It only took a moment to recognize the emotion radiating from the boy. It was fear. Izuku shook his head and crouched down, wrapping his fingers around the base of the kite before extending his arm in an attempt to cheer the boy up. "Here," he said simply. However, tears simply welled up in the boy's eyes. He stood, petrified until the calls of his mother reached him. "Come here," she called, voice slightly shaking. And without any hesitance, the boy ran blindly into the woman's arms, sobbing into her chest. She began to lower herself, soothing the boy and ruffling his hair. After a moment, she shot Izuku a dirty look, her own heartbeats quickening. The freckled boy simply lowered his arm, dropping the kite to the ground before walking away. "I want to be a hero." Locks of green hung over Izuku's eyes, but he brushed them away upon hearing a booming yet kind voice. He froze for a moment, raising his head to see a large, blond man on the TV. Recognizing the man instantly, Izuku whispered his name. "All Might." Now, a reporter spoke to him with a smile, legs crossed as the hero sat in the chair a few feet away. "We know you've saved countless civilians, All Might. But exactly why do you do it?" Izuku felt his breaths become silent as he waited for the man's response. Not even bothering to waste a moment, All Might grinned. Well, because everyone needs a hero. And no matter the circumstances, I'll smile when they cannot. In their dark times, I'd like to be their ray of hope. The freckled boy gulped, feeling a lump rise in his throat. I want to be like him. Izuku raised his head, eyes fluttering open to see his hero standing above him. Thought we lost you there. The man grinned, standing up, hands on his hips. Izuku didn't bother to hold his tongue. I want to be like you. All Might looked a bit surprised before chuckling. Well, I hope you'll succeed. The freckled boy then sat up, beginning to stand before realizing his hero was leaving. Wait, Izuku said, where are you going? Being a hero means being busy, kid, All Might said casually, stretching. Izuku stepped forwards, brow furrowed. You can't leave. The man stiffened at the boy's monotone tone. Is that a threat? He asked calmly. Izuku, not having noticed his tone, simply stepped forwards once again. I need to ask you something. I don't have time for this, All Might replied quickly, shaking his head. Sorry kid, but I have dash. The man froze as he felt a hand wrap around his wrist, a chill going down his spine as he met Izuku's eyes. You need to answer me. All Might furrowed his brows in suspicion. I don't appreciate that tone, young man. I just need to know, Izuku replied. The man paused before tearing his arm from Izuku's grasp, rubbing his wrist and hiding his surprise at the boy's grip. You're being awfully pushy. You're afraid of me. All Might whipped his head around. What? I can see it, All Might, Izuku said quietly. You're afraid that I'm going to hurt you. What do you dash? Izuku interrupted the man. Fears can change rapidly depending on the situation. And right now, he said simply, you think that I might be a villain, or that I might be trying to attack. Now, he continued, you're scared that I'm being accurate with my analysis, and because I'm continuing you're even more freaked out and dash. All Might took his turn in cutting off the boy. What is your quirk, kid? Izuku paused for a moment. I can create people's worst nightmares. The man looked startled, stepping back from the boy. But, the freckled boy glanced to the side, I still want to be a hero, so you don't have to worry about me hurting you or anything. He paused for a moment before staring into the hero's eyes. That who's all for one? All Might turned pale, ignoring everything said previously. How do you know that name? It's what you're most afraid of, Izuku answered. Who is that? Thoughts ran through the man's mind at 1,000,000 miles per minute. He wasn't about to trust some random kid on the street, especially considering how creepy he came off, but he also couldn't allow him to spread the name around. Ah, I see, Izuku said, breaking All Might free from his thoughts. Now you're afraid that I'll tell people about him. Don't worry, he shrugged. If it's that important, I won't mention it. All Might felt his shoulders relax slightly. Still, his jaw was tense. Something about the kid in front of him was unsettling. Before he could continue his train of thoughts, however, the man's eyes suddenly widened as a sharp pain shot through his stomach, smoke rising from his skin. Panicked, he stumbled backwards into the tunnel, catching the attention of Izuku. The boy raised a brow. Your true form? Why are you afraid of dash? Smoke began to fill the area, sending Izuku into a coughing fit and breaking off his train of thought. And by the time he could raise his head, all that stood before him was a frail man. Izuku blinked, staring directly at the man. Well, that's certainly strange. Inko pressed her hand against her cheek as she watched Izuku sit in the chair beside her, expression unreadable. She bit her cheek to prevent tears from dripping out, taking in a shaky breath before turning towards the doctor. I don't understand, she said quietly. He was never like this before. My best guess, the doctor replied, catching her attention and, unbeknownst to her, Izuku's. The man looked down at Izuku, who just barely furrowed his brows as he felt a sense of unease towards him. Still, he simply sat silently and listened. Is that the nature of Izuku's quirk inspired these emotional changes? A crease made its appearance known in Inko's forehead as she scooted forward in her chair. What do you mean? His quirk is called Nightmare, correct? The doctor asked. Inko paused before nodding. I believe it allows him to make people's fears into a reality, she said, a bit uneasily as her eyes flicked down towards her son. Well, to put it simply, fear is the basis for many other sorts of emotions. Without that fear, however, emotions are dull or, sometimes, they outright disappear. Because of this, the most emotion Izuku will experience from now on is the smallest fraction of what average people do. The woman bit her lip, hand instinctively flying to her chest as she looked down at Izuku. As if he could sense her sadness, the boy looked up at her, causing her to startle slightly. His big, green eyes pierced through her, sending a chill down her spine. Still, the boy made the effort to give a soft smile. Inko's heart squeezed in her chest, tears dripping down her cheeks. "Aizu," she whispered softly. "It's okay, Mommy," he said kindly, attempting to find the words. "I don't mind." Somehow, she felt like he was lying. "Quirks are a part of people," the doctor spoke up once again, not giving either the time to speak further, "and they cannot be removed." Izuku didn't mention the lie. Because of this, it's safe to say that Izuku's emotions cannot be repaired. "Well, that's certainly strange," Izuku said, staring at the man as he blinked. All Might almost gaped at the boy's lack of interest, but instead took to sliding down the wall with a sigh. "I was expecting more of a reaction, if I'm being honest." Izuku shrugged, taking a place next to All Might. "That's kind of difficult to do when you don't have any emotions." Now that made All Might do a double take. "You what?" The boy didn't seem to care about his reaction, instead looking off lazily to the side. "It's a part of my quirk. My doctor explained it like this. Fear is the basis for many other sorts of emotions. Without that fear, however, emotions are dull or, sometimes, they outright disappear." He turned towards All Might. "At first it was upsetting, but I can't really be bothered to care anymore." "And yet," All Might said, cogs working in his mind as he furrowed his brows. "You still want to be a hero?" Izuku looked to the side, and it almost looked as if he were about to smile. "Almost. Yeah. It's always been a dream of mine. I guess I just stuck with it. Besides," he said in a softer tone, "I want my mom to have somebody to be proud of. Not to mention," he trailed off before continuing, though All Might could tell that he was keeping something to himself. "I see," he replied, deciding not to push for information. "I suppose you're not curious about my circumstances, then?" The boy sat up slightly, scratching his jaw. "I wouldn't say that. If anything, my curiosity is worse than before. Can't be afraid to ask questions if you have no fear, right? I guess," he just barely shrugged, "that I'm not. Curious for normal reasons like, I don't know, being afraid of something that might happen if I don't know. Regretting not asking. But still," he finally said, "I'd still say I was curious." All Might couldn't help but notice the awkward silence that was left without a small chuckle at the end of the sentence. Ignoring it, however, he simply smiled to himself. Curiosity is always a good thing to have. Izuku tilted his head slightly, and All Might chuckled before letting out a slight sigh. "Sorry, kid, I can't say anything about the whole all-for-one deal. But since you already know," his eyes flicked towards the boy, "I suppose I can explain my situation." After a brief moment of silence, the man continued, fingers drifting down to the bottom of his shirt before pulling it up to reveal the scar where his stomach should be. "It's pretty gross. I got this scar in a fight about 5 years back. My respiratory system was basically destroyed. I lost my whole stomach," he mumbled, tone a bit sick. "All the surgeries have pretty much worn me out." Izuku glanced downwards. 5 years ago, he raised his head. "That couldn't have been the fight with Toxic Chainsaw." All Might gave a slight smile. "I guess you really know your stuff. But you're right. It wasn't him." He didn't say anything, but Izuku could hear the words screaming at him. The fear of all for one surrounded him, the feeling almost palpable. Kid, in a way, your quirk is a bit comforting," All Might suddenly said, chuckling. Izuku sat upwards, and he swore he almost felt surprised. "I know that I'm supposed to be this symbol of peace. Someone indestructible. Unwavering." He swallowed back the lump in his throat, pain evident in his eyes. "But heroes get scared. It seems that people can forget that they're people too. After All Might noticed the tension in the air, he gave a slight, awkward laugh. Sorry for the heavy topic. I chose this life because I wanted to help people in the first place. I shouldn't be complaining. Izuku didn't bother hesitating with his response. I don't mind, he said simply, though it almost caused All Might to reel back in surprise. I mean, like you said, heroes are people too. People, he glanced to the side. People have emotions. They get scared. I know I'm not really the best person to say anything like that, but I can remember what it was like to be scared. I wouldn't say I liked it, but it was humanizing in a way. It's a distant memory now, though. All Might swore his heart clenched. It wasn't out of pity, though. There was a sort of understanding. What do you remember? All Might asked. Izuku turned towards him. About what? All Might smiled softly. Your emotions. Oh. The boy looked down into his lap. I don't know. Not much, I guess. It's not like I can really relive the sensation. It's like reaching into a room and trying to grab something, but your hand just goes through it, I guess. He scratched his jaw. I'd say my favorite emotion was probably excitement, though. I vaguely remember being excited about seeing heroes. Wanting to be a hero. That kind of thing. The man certainly wasn't expecting such an answer from the boy, but he didn't say much in reply. It didn't seem like Izuku wanted him to pity him. So instead, he just hummed in reply. I see. Well, Izuku said suddenly, brushing his hands on his pants as he stood. I'm sure you're busy, so dash. What's your name? All Might asked, interrupting the boy. Izuku paused for a moment. Midoriya. Midoriya Izuku. All Might grinned, pushing himself to the ground and sticking his hand out. Tashinori Yagi. The boy stared at his hand for a moment, seemingly trying to process whatever was going on. Oh, he said simply. He then stared at All Might's smiling face, taking his hand and robotically shaking it. All Might chuckled, dropping his hand after a few moments. You should probably work on that handshake, kid. Izuku simply stared, but the man had gotten used to his odd responses by now. He stopped briefly, raising his head towards the tunnel's ceiling. Let's say you were given the opportunity to have another quirk. A more powerful one. He raised his brow curiously at the boy. Would you take it? Izuku didn't hesitate much. No. I think there are way more people that'd deserve something like that more than I do. Somebody that was quirkless, maybe. Or someone that could really feel for the people in danger. He shrugged. I've already got my quirk, and I've decided to use it as best as I can. All Might chuckled. Spoken like a true hero. Anyways, I should get going, All Might. My mom's probably worried about me. The man could have sworn he saw the boy smirk as he walked away, but he brushed it off immediately. Have fun teaching. I hope I see you at you. The man stood silently for a moment, watching as the boy exited the tunnel with a shocked expression on his face. After he was out of his sight, however, All Might threw his head back in laughter. Well then, he said as his laughter died down, I hope I see you too, young Midoriya. Izuku rolled his shoulders, hands stuffed in his pockets as he headed home. As he continued on, he allowed his eyes to wander before he suddenly paused. Fear, he mumbled, feeling as a headache wormed its way behind his skull. His hands twitched upwards to reach towards his green locks, but he quickly brought them back down, attempting to ignore the mess around him. Varying sizes of hazy, purple clouds lingered around each and every person. His head pounded each time he neared someone, each having more stress and fear than the last. Once his headache had clouded over his mind, he took in a deep breath and ducked into an alley to collect his thoughts. The pain faded to a dull throb once he made it to the middle, sliding down against the wall. How do you feel about me now? He said to no one in particular, head pressed against the cold, concrete wall. He half expected a joyful response, but didn't react when he received none. The boy's eyes dragged themselves downwards, hand reaching up to scratch the back of his neck. I'm glad I can't feel awkwardness, because I'm sure it'd really be coming through for me right about now. He glanced to the side, head pointed forwards. I'll see you again. When I'm a hero. Stretching, Izuku pushed himself off the ground, pulling his hood from his neck before dropping his hands to the sides. He watched his breath for a moment, seeing as the smokiness danced in the air. his nose tinged with the cold, but he ignored it in the moment, simply turning back towards the exit of the alley. Just as the boy was about to leave, however, he felt someone bump into him. "Watch it," a hooded figure rasped. Izuku stared as the man walked away and inserted a key into one of the alley's buildings, blue wisps of hair protruding from the sides of his hood. After the man had stepped inside, Izuku shook himself out of his daze, attempting to push back the feelings that surrounded the man. Shaking his head, Izuku straightened himself and walked outside, speeding up in order to avoid a bigger headache than he could deal with. Elsewhere, though, a figure watched from above, chewing the inside of his cheek as his eyes followed the green-haired boy. Just as Izuku turned, however, the feeling of being watched disappeared as if it hadn't been there in the first place. "Hey Mom," Izuku said as he stepped inside, quietly slipping off his shoes before walking inside. "Oh, Aizu," his mother chirped, hurrying over. "Let me take to Dash." "It's fine," he replied as he pulled his bag away, causing her to pause before looking to the side. "Sorry, honey," she said softly, laughing nervously. "It's just hard to believe how you grew up so fast." Izuku pulled his bag over his shoulder, nodding. "I should go do my homework." "Yes." His mother nodded frantically, her smile slightly strained. "You go do that. I'll just be over in the kitchen fixing up dinner." A moment before entering the hall, Izuku paused, turning back until his eyes settled upon her. "Mom," he said simply, eyes wandering down to her scarred leg before darting back up. She glanced upwards. "Yes, sweetie." Izuku looked down before offering her the smallest of smiles. "Love you." Inko stared at him for a moment, eyes having been widened by a fraction. After she seemed to have found her words, though, she broke out in a grin. "I love you too, Aizu." After a lingering moment, Izuku turned around, still feeling the woman's joy from the room over. Once in his room, his eyes lazily drifted along, his body moving automatically as he placed his bag next to his chair before falling on top of it. He paused after pulling out his homework, staring emptily into the wall. "Mom," Izuku mumbled, tracing his finger against the wall, "don't worry about me. I'll become a hero." He dropped his hand, looking up at the ceiling. "No matter what it takes." Izuku closed his eyes, watching as purple smoke danced in his darkened vision. "Mom, look," he giggled, tugging on her dress as the same smoke danced in his hand, curling around his wrist and springing into the air before drifting in circles. She said, eyes flicking down before a surprised expression crossed her face. "Oh my." She crouched down next to the boy, offering him a wide smile as she ruffled his hair. "Is that your quirk, Aizu?" Izuku giggled once again before nodding up and down as fast as he could. "Yup. I don't really know what it does yet, but..." He glanced towards the smoke, biting his lip, only for his eyes to widen as the smoke began to spiral upwards into a cloud. The boy stepped backwards, voice slightly shaky. "Mom." Inko looked at the boy's hand, which was rapidly producing the smoke, a slight gasp escaping her lips. "Can you stop it?" Izuku shook his frantically, practically on the edge of tears. As he became more panicked, the smoke grew, as if it were rebelling against him. Suddenly, the smoke shot into the air, rapidly piling together before exploding to a semi-transparent beast. Horns shot up from its head and its jaw grew into a sharp underbite, yellow eyes contrasting against its purple skin. With the force of the blast, Izuku stumbled to the ground, hand falling to his side as his entire body trembled before the monster. Hopelessness snatched the boy in its unforgiving grip, a sort of terror enveloping him, one that he had never felt before. Please," he whispered pleadingly, tears dripping down his cheeks and falling from his chin, "leave me alone." The boy continued to inch backwards, unaware of his mother's calls towards him, each word falling deaf upon his ears. Soon, though, he found himself pressed against the wall, a supreme sense of dread overtaking him. "No," he whispered. Izuku watched, terrified as the beast's claw reached out towards him, a horrible, guttural roar erupting from its stomach. And upon feeling a hissing sensation over his eye, he screamed, voice piercing the air. His hand immediately slapped against the wound, only to come back with blood. The boy breathed heavily and quickly, the corners of his vision darkening as he shook. He clawed at his scalp, repeatedly running his hands through his hair while his skull throbbed and became clouded. "Izuku!" his mother cried out, causing the boy's head to immediately snap upwards. He watched in surprise as she gritted her teeth, one hand pressed against her temple while the other was raised in front of her, shaking. At the end of her fingertips was the beast's foot, still in the air as the rest of its body thrashed around. And despite her situation, Inko turned with a tired, pained look in order to give Izuku a smile. It'll be okay, Aizu. Just calm down, she spoke softly. Her voice was quick though, and Izuku could almost hear the fear in her voice. Izuku's throat felt dry, but he still yelled out to her, voice practically shooting in waves as he stumbled forwards, vision blurred from the tears in his eyes. "Mommy!" She breathed heavily, her arms slowly drifting downwards. "I'm fine, Aizu. You're fine. It's all right." Just as the last words left her lips, however, her arm fell limp and her body fell towards the floor. Izuku was unable to suppress the scream that erupted from his throat as the beast shot its now freed foot forwards, ripping into the flesh of his mother's leg. "And," he screamed, falling over his mother as he watched blood pour down her leg. His tears dripped on her skin, a shadow hanging over them and gaining mass quickly. Inko simply smiled up at Izuku, however, giving him a shaky smile as her hands softly brushed against his cheek. "See, Aizu? You're just fine." Izuku froze for a moment, head hanging low as he trembled. However, once the beast's foot was just about to reach the two, Izuku whipped his head around, rage emanating off of the boy as he shouted. "Enough!" he barked, causing the beast to immediately stop in his tracks. After taking in a deep, rattly breath, Izuku raised his head towards the beast, narrowing his eyes. "Disappear!" he growled, watching as it paused before bowing down and dissipating. Into a wisp, its smoke immediately flying back into the boy's body. Izuku remained still for a moment, panting, when his ears suddenly perked up at a particularly heavy breath from his mother. "Mom!" he cried out once again, panicked as he looked into her eyes. The woman inhaled sharply before coughing. Her lips then curled into a small smile despite the stinging sensation that throbbed in her leg. "I'm glad you're safe, Aizu. That's all that matters, right?" Izuku suddenly broke free from his daydream, finding that his hand was hovering over his left eye, the one that the beast had left its mark on. It was as if he had expected to cry. But like always, there was nothing there. How could there be? The boy quickly shook his head before sighing. "Next time I'll be there for you, Mom. I'll save you. I'll save as many people as I can," he mumbled to himself. He wasn't supposed to care. He wasn't supposed to feel anything. And he didn't. But somehow he knew it was right. Right to be good. Right to be there for others. Right to want to be a hero. His name was Izuku Fang Midoriya. At least that's what Bakuga's friends seemed to think. "What are you doing here?" one sneered. "Taking the exam," Izuku replied bluntly, pulling up his scarf. Bakuga's other friend smirked. "And you're wearing a scarf because?" "I don't have emotions, but I still have common sense." "Something that you don't seem to have," he mumbled, watching as the other boy sputtered. "Besides, I still get cold." Bakuga rolled his eyes and placed his hand on the boy's shoulders when they tried to speak up. "Shut up, you dumbass. It's not like you're even trying to take the exams." Bakuga," one whined. "I thought you were supposed to be on our side." The blonde scoffed as he walked away, holding up his middle finger for all to see. "Not when you're being idiots." While Bakuga's friends gave Izuku a look that mixed incredulousness and a sort of annoyance, he simply shrugged and walked away, falling into step with the blonde. "Thanks," he said. "Teach," Bakuga rolled his eyes. "I didn't do it for you, Diamond nerd. You just happened to be there." Izuku simply hummed in reply and, although Bakuga seemed annoyed, he gave no indication for him to leave. So, until they reached the front entrance, both boys continued in silence. "Stop following me." Bakuga finally barked as they were going to the auditorium. The freckled boy blinked. "We need to go to the same place." The blonde looked annoyed, but he couldn't do much except glare. After quickly closing his mouth and shaking away the embarrassed blush, though Bakugo sped up as much as possible while still walking, clearly trying to avoid the freckled boy. Izuku, of course, didn't understand why, but didn't bother to think about it much. God damn it. Bakugo cursed under his breath as his childhood friend fell into the seat next to him, adjusting his bag on the back of the chair before straightening. Is that present Mike? Izuku suddenly said, squinting at the stage. Bakugo leaned forward slightly. That I think so, he mumbled. The freckled boy sat backwards. The blonde's eye twitched. What? He has a small cloud of fear around him. Looks like he might be afraid of nobody responding when he calls out, Izuku mentioned casually. Bakugo stared at the boy for a moment. You know what people are afraid of? Izuku raised a brow. That is my quirk. The blonde paused for a moment before shaking his head and crossing his arms. Just don't try that creepy shit on me. Like most of the time, Izuku simply hummed in reply, leaving Bakugo to sit back and cross his arms. Only moments later, Present Mike stepped up to the center of the stage, a wide grin spread across his face. Hey there, listeners, he shouted out, clearly expecting his words to be returned. Before Bakugo had any clue what was going on, he heard Izuku speak up next to him. Whoa, he yelled out. Though, it sounded incredibly awkward with his half-monotone voice. Present Mike laughed nervously, clearly unsure if the boy was mocking him or genuinely trying to be nice. Anyways, he moved on, shaking the feeling off and putting his smile back on. Thanks for tuning into your school, DJ. I'll be here to tell ya about the main show. His lips quirked upwards into a smile. Are you ready? Izuku, once again, replied in his flat voice. Yeah. This time, though, there were a few more participants in the reply. Most notably, Bakugo. Wait, Bakugo yelled before trailing off awkwardly, cheeks reddened. The blonde was about to awkwardly look away when he caught Izuku staring at him. He said. What is it, Deku? Izuku shrugged. I just didn't think you'd say anything. That was nice of you. Bakugo blinked in surprise as Izuku turned back towards Present Mike, but he held his tongue before he could say anything except for a mumbled, whatever. Like the application said. Present Mike said with a goofier grin and a straighter back than before. Today you rockin' boys and girls will be out there conducting 10-minute mock battles in super hip urban settings. He fumbled with a remote for a moment before pressing a button that brought up a screen behind him. Present Mike gestured towards the labeled areas. After I drop off the mic here, you'll be headed to your specified battle centers. Sound good? The man seemed as if he were about to take a step back when a resounding yeah erupted through the hall. He then adjusted his glasses, blinking incredulously at the crowd. Well, listeners, he grinned widely as the noise died down. I've never had such a responsive crowd. He winked. Thanks for that. But, he said after a moment, to get on with the program, you should all have cards you received at the front desk. They look like simple IDs, but they'll also show you which center you'll be in. Present Mike stayed silent for a few moments, allowing the students to look down at their IDs. I see, Bakugo said. They're splitting us up so we can't work with our friends. Izuku nodded. Our examinee numbers are one after the other, but we're assigned to different battle centers. The blonde gave a slight smirk. DMN. And I was really looking forward to crushing you. Izuku slightly raised a brow, but Bakugo had already turned, so he did the same. Okay. Present Mike said, bringing the auditorium's attention back towards him. Let's check out your charts. The man quickly switched the screen, showing darkened figures with varying points next to their forms. There are 3 types of foe villains in every battle center. You'll earn points based on their level of difficulty, so you better choose wisely. The man continued as the screen behind him played an example video in some sort of video game layout. Your goal in this trial is to use your quirk to raise your score by shredding these villains like a mid-song guitar solo. But, he warned, raising his finger towards the audience, check it. Make sure you keep things heroic. Attacking other examinees at UA is a no-no, you dig? Just as Present Mike was about to continue, a blue-haired boy a few rows in front of Izuku stood. Excuse me, sir. He caught the man's attention, back completely straight. I have a question. Present Mike glanced towards the boy before grinning. Hit me. The blue-haired boy pointed to his paper and nodded. On the printout, you've listed 4 types of villains, not 3. With all due respect, if this is an error on official UA material, it is shameful. He put the paper down, hand placed over his heart as he spoke outwardly. We are exemplary students. We expect the best from Japan's most notable school. A mistake such as this won't do. Additionally, he turned, his finger pointed directly towards Midoriya and Bakugo, you too. You've been chatting this whole time. Stop that. If you can't bother to take this seriously, then leave. You're distracting the rest of us. While Bakugo shot the blue-haired boy an annoyed glare, Midoriya tilted his head to the side. He was more preoccupied with the fact that, throughout his entire speech, the boy didn't give off an ounce of embarrassment or fear. It struck the boy as odd since even the most confident people have exuded at least a small amount of awkwardness or something along those lines, but this blue-haired boy didn't seem perturbed in the least. Why aren't you afraid? Izuku asked, ignoring the boy's accusations. The boy immediately looked confused, brows knitting together as he slightly stumbled backwards. What? Most people I see speak in public are at least a little scared about something or other, the freckled boy continued, flicking towards present Mike before settling back on the blue-haired boy, but you're not. Why is that? The boy blinked confusedly. I'm not sure I understand. Izuku continued staring at him, locking the two in an uneasy, well, at least for the other boy, silence. After a moment, though, Izuku shook his head and glanced lazily to the side. Never mind. All right. Present Mike clapped, grabbing back everyone's attention. Examinee number 7111. Thanks for calling in with your request. The boy blinked and shook his head, eyes just barely glancing towards Izuku before he turned back around and nodded. The 4th villain, Present Mike continued, pointing at the screen, is worth 0 points. That guy's just an obstacle we'll be throwing in your way. There's one in every battle center. Think of it as a hurdle you should try to avoid. It's not that it can't be beaten, but there's kinda no point. He grinned, though he gave off the tiniest sense of unease aimed towards Izuku, and raised his hand in the air. I suggest my listeners try to ignore it and focus on the ones at the top of the charts. The blue-haired boy said, awkwardly bowing while he glanced back once again. Thank you very much. Please continue. Ugh, Bakugo rolled his eyes. I can practically feel the tension in this room. Izuku raised a brow. What do you mean? Really? The blonde replied annoyedly. You can't even tell that much? The freckled boy simply shrugged. Whatever, Bakugo brushed him off. It's not worth an explanation. But Izuku began, but closed his mouth once the blonde shot him another look. Although he didn't understand, he decided not to push anything and instead face back towards the front. That's all I've got for you today. Present Mike grinned, making a jazz hands motion. I'll sign you off with a sample of our school motto. As General Napoleon Bonaparte once laid down, a true hero is one who overcomes life's misfortunes. Now that's a tasty sound bite. He laughed for a moment before bending slightly towards the audience, finger placed on his glasses. Are you ready to go beyond? The man then raised his hand in the air, the school's motto displayed on the screen behind him. Let's hear a plus ultra. As soon as he finished with his last word, the audience collectively yelled the motto before erupting into hoots and hollers. Present Mike chuckled once the noise fizzled out. Now that's what I call a good reception. Anyways, he turned, grinning. I hope you practiced more than hitting just books. After he finished speaking, the man waved before heading off the stage, allowing everybody to start packing up their things as they chatted. You know, Deku, Bakugo said, though there was no trace of his usual smirk, or even scowl, on his face, I'm going to be number 1. Izuku watched as the blonde walked away, head tilted to the side when, out of nowhere, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He said, barely giving a reaction besides a basic head turn. The blue-haired boy behind him said awkwardly, I normally wouldn't like to disturb other participants, but, he shook his head, straightening himself. What were you talking about before? Fear and such. Izuku blinked before looking at the incredibly tall ceiling. That's my quirk. I can sense people's fears. Make them come to life, he said in his usual monotone voice. I don't know if I made you uncomfortable or anything, so I guess sorry if I did. My quirk took away my emotions as well. The boy looked surprised. Took away your emotions? No idea what anything feels like anymore, he shrugged before putting on a bright grin. Though I can fake it pretty well after years of practice. Again, the blue-haired boy blinked, watching as the happiness melted from Izuku's face and back into a dull look. Everyone thinks I'm going to be a villain. I don't want to be, though. Guess that's why I'm here, Izuku said before beginning to walk away. Anyways, good luck. After a moment of silence, the other boy spoke up. I didn't catch your name. Izuku turned slightly, raising a brow. I didn't throw it. After a moment of awkward sputtering, the boy let out a chuckle, bowing. My name is Tenya Ida. I apologize if I caused you any troubles earlier. Izuku stared at the boy, waiting for him to straighten himself back up. Oh, Izuku Midoriya. Ida instantly shot back into a standing position. Nice to meet you, Midoriya, he greeted. Brightly, though Izuku could tell some sort of fear was creeping in the back of his mind. I hope we can both make it into the hero course. The freckled boy remained silent for a moment before he nodded. Yeah. Toshinori sat back in his chair, eyeing the screen curiously. He hummed to himself, lips quirking up into a smile as familiar green hair came into view. Although it was barely noticeable, the man leaned forwards at the sight of the boy, only catching Aizawa's attention. However, the man made no comment, instead opting to hold his tongue as he watched carefully. It looks like we have quite a bit of promising young students this year, Nizu commented cheerfully, leafing through the papers in his hands. I must admit, Midnight said, lips curled into a somewhat unnerving smile, I'm intrigued. Snipe adjusted the brim of his hat as he spoke. Is there anyone we're specifically watching out for? He asked casually. Nizu hummed in reply, eyes drifting over the papers once again. Oh, he grinned, bringing out the paperwork of none other than a certain blonde. For one, we have Katsuki Bakugu. He slid the paper towards the other teachers, waiting for a moment as they glanced over each other's shoulders to scan it quickly. He seems to have quite a versatile quirk, Midnight mentioned, brows higher than usual. Cementos nodded. And his test scores are quite exemplary. Who else? Ectoplasm asked. Nizu had already finished sifting through the pile before the man even asked, hand outstretched to place the next on the desk. Tenya Ida, brother of pro-hero Ingenium. Not only is he quite intelligent, but we already know his quirk is pro-hero material. If he learns how to use it correctly, Aizawa mentioned, rolling his eyes. The principal didn't react negatively, instead smiling. Yes, of course not. But as long as a teacher would train him well, he said, smirking as he looked at an annoyed Aizawa, I think he'd do just fine. Assuming he gets in, Aizawa said, sighing. Just assuming he gets in. Anyways, Nizu continued, there are a few others. Nito Minoma, Ibara Shiozaki, and Tsu Azui, just to name a few. He tossed each file on the table, allowing the teachers to look through them. His sight, however, was quickly drawn towards Toshinori, whose lip just barely twitched. Have anyone else to recommend All Might? Nizu asked, smiling. The other teachers turned towards him, brow raised, and the man awkwardly laughed. Well, I might have someone in mind. But dash. Oh, come on, you can't say something like that and just not tell us. Midnight teased. All Might. Vlad King leaned forwards. I'd be interested to know as well. Don't be worried about this affecting any decisions, by the way, Nizu mentioned, having noticed the man's apprehensiveness. Your comments won't go towards his application, if you don't wish them to. Toshinori's shoulders slightly relaxed. Well, his eyes flicked towards the screen, watching as the freckled boy chatted with Ida. Izuku Midoriya would get my recommendation. Midnight grinned. Oh, do tell more. Well, the man laughed awkwardly. I ran into him several months before the exams. It was just a brief encounter, but... Well, that must mean he was quite the student, no? Nizu smiled, causing the other teachers to glance at him nervously. I suppose, Toshinori replied. I'm told that the boy was bullied throughout his middle schools for having a so-called villainous quirk. He stiffened slightly, remembering what the boy had said to him. He knows everyone's greatest fear just by looking at them. He can create them with his quirk. Nizu's eyes widened by just a fraction, which was more than enough of a reaction if you knew him, but the other teachers were too preoccupied with eyeing each other nervously. Just like you, I was quick to judge the boy. However, Midoriya still knows right from wrong. He even told me he was pushing himself so hard because he wanted to make his mother proud, Toshinori said, chuckling. Not to mention, he gave a slight grin. He's quite adept with analytical skills. I didn't get to see it closely, but the kid's got a notebook filled with hero notes. He even knew I was going to teach at UA. Still not sure how. The room was silent for a moment. Nizu knew it was likely because, with all of the information they had to take in, one thing was for certain. If Izuku Midoriya wanted to be, he could be a real threat. And Nizu found that incredibly interesting. Izuku wasn't sure why, but he felt as if dozens of eyes were on him. And one pair in particular that he didn't want to get involved with. Ignoring the feeling, though, he rolled his shoulders and stretched his hands over his head, waiting until the countdown would begin. And, right on time, Present Mic's voice called down from a perch that Izuku had assumed was a few miles away. After his eyes fell upon the man's location, he listened carefully, waiting for him to continue after his initial greeting. Right, let's start, his voice echoed. And without a second glance back, Izuku was off, rushing through the door and glancing around for any signs of robot life. Get moving, he heard the man shout from behind. There are no countdowns in real battles. Run, 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 listeners. You're wasting your time here. Just as Izuku had destroyed his third robot, the other examinees had rushed in. He watched as Ida sped past with a tilted head before shaking his head. It's not the time to study quirks, he mumbled, continuing to search. His ears perked up after a few moments, hearing the faint pitter-patter of a heartbeat. And without wasting any time, Izuku whipped around the corner, watching as somebody was pushed to the ground by another bot. Shooting out his hand, the boy allowed smoke to escape from his palm and form into the shape of a smaller version of his childhood bear, a beast he'd named Kage. Growling, Kage charged forwards, throwing the bot against the wall like a bull with his horns. After ensuring that the robot was down, Izuku bent down next to the boy, reaching out his hand. You all right? He asked. The boy looked suspiciously at his hand before nodding and pushing himself off the ground. Yeah. I was fine without your help, though, he said, shaking his head and walking away. Unfazed, Izuku simply turned his head and headed towards the next sound, a screech of a robot's wheels against the pavement. A two-pointer, he mumbled to himself, allowing Kage to take down the robot just as easily. After taking out a few more, the boy sighed, glancing backwards. However, he was quickly interrupted by a sudden rumbling that nearly threw him to the ground. Hand twitching, the boy crept out into the open, only to jump backwards as a herd of students rushed past him. Ruin, one shouted, the others panicking just as much. Izuku's hand flew up to his head, teeth gritted as his head began to pound. I need to get out of here, he whispered, nearly falling against the wall. However, an awful feeling began to loom over him, drawing his attention to a growing cloud of purple smoke. Initially, he had suspected it was coming from the collective crowd, but when he saw that it wasn't moving, he realized that it had belonged to a single person. The boy took in a deep breath, not even bothering to consider his own health as he threw himself into the middle of the panic, blindly rushing through the crowd. Even as his vision blurred from the raging migraine, Izuku continued pushing towards the cloud, breaths getting heavier. He felt his body become sluggish with the pure amount of fear that lingered in the air, and for the briefest of moments he considered letting himself fall, but then he finally saw it. Squinting his eyes, Izuku saw that there was a girl trapped beneath the rubble, feet already moving before he even registered what was going on. Gritting his teeth and pressing one palm against his head, he was sure that pulsing wasn't healthy. He allowed whispers of smoke to fly from his fingertips. Izuku, however, soon realized that, in his state, he wasn't going to be much help in taking down the humongous robot that loomed over the two. So, he did the next best thing, and forced Kage to rip the rubble from the girl's foot. Without any further thoughts, he picked the girl from the ground, breaths quickening as he took in her terror. He knew that he should most definitely not be so close to such a strong sense of terror, but it wasn't like he could just leave the girl there. Which is probably why, when the two had finally found themselves several kilometers away and at the end of the time limit, with Izuku having tripped over his own feet several times, he was much closer to the ground than he remembered being. Or, more likely, he was on the ground. Yeah. Probably option 2. Izuku stared down at the envelope before him, his mother having delivered it to him with frantic eyes only moments prior. After a moment, though, he broke himself from his small daze and carefully broke the seal. He raised a brow at the lack of a letter, only to find a disc inside. And after placing it on his desk, he pressed the button that rested on the top. Before Izuku could process much, a small beam of light shot up from the disc before developing into a projection. And wasting no time, the video played itself, bringing All Might to the center of attention. "Hello, young Midoriya," he grinned, giving a thumbs up. "It's been a while, hasn't it? I mean, there's no need to respond since I can't actually hear you, but that's besides the point." He raised a brow as he leaned towards the screen, an expression of dread crossing his face. "I have to do how many of these things?" The man sighed before straightening and putting on his famous smile once again. "With great power comes a great amount of paperwork, I suppose. Which means," he gave a chuckle, "you were right with your assumption. I am UA's newest faculty member. And as I'm sure you can tell by this point, I'll be the one delivering your results." Izuku scooted forward in his chair, eyeing the screen. "First up, you passed the written test. Congratulations. You've got quite a head on your shoulders, young man. As for the practical exam," he grimaced, "you only got about 30 villain points. While impressive in its own right, it's not enough to ensure your entry into the hero course." The boy felt his fingers twitch. However, All Might winked, there were other factors. He turned towards the screen behind him, finger tapping on a button. "But before we get on to that, here's a short clip for your viewing pleasure." Izuku turned his attention towards the second, smaller video, where it showed an empty room before the door creaked open. "Hello," a girl's voice spoke up. Her eyes wandered to the side before settling on Present Mike, who just came into view. "Sorry for interrupting. Do you have a sec?" "Sure, little listener," the man beamed. "What's up?" The girl, now recognizable as the one Izuku had saved during the practical exam, smiled awkwardly. "There was this boy. About this tall," she said, putting her hand slightly above her head, "looks kind of plain and with a bunch of freckles. Anyways," she said after realizing that she was rambling, "I wanted to make sure he passed. I know he had to waste some time to save me and," she took in a shaky breath, "I'd hate it if he failed because of me, you know? So I was just wondering if..." She shook her head before raising it. "If he failed, I'd like you to give him my points." She shrunk a bit, "If that's okay, I mean." Izuku took in a breath as he watched in silence, head turning towards All Might. The man smiled, a softer one compared to his usual heroic grin. "You can inspire others, young man. That's why I am here." The man put his shoulders back, turning the video back on. "You see, the practical exam was not graded on combat alone." After a moment, Present Mike chuckled, drawing Izuku's attention. "Thanks for coming to the station with your request. But there's no need for that, little listener," he said, patting her head. "The kid's chartin' well on his own." Izuku watched as the screen shifted, a new type of points appearing in the next column. "We also have rescue points," All Might explained happily. "A panel of judges watches, and they award points for heroic acts just beyond fighting villains. Izuku Midoriya," he paused briefly, "you've earned a total of 45 rescue points. And Achiko Uraraka, for helping you receive the care that you needed, earns 25 rescue points." He turned around, grinning. "You both passed the exam." All Might smiled, and it seemed as if he were staring directly at the boy. "Midoriya Izuku. You've made it. Welcome to your hero academia." Izuku watched as the projection was drawn back into the disc, his eyes glued onto the wall where the video once was. "I made it," he mumbled. And he couldn't help but notice he had scored in second place. Right behind. He clenched his fist, watching as purple smoke coiled around his wrist. After a moment, it allowed it to dissipate, sitting still as the clock ticked by. Once minutes had already passed, Izuku stood, pushing the door open to see his mom waiting outside for him. "Well?" she asked with bated breath, tears already brimming in her vision. I made it," he said in a quiet voice. The woman's eyes widened and she threw herself forwards, arms wrapped tightly around her son. "Oh, Aizu," she sobbed, though with a bright smile on her face. "I'm so proud of you." Izuku took in a deep breath, accepting her hug and allowing himself to give her one of his own. "Thanks, Mom." Shoyuda Aizawa was annoyed. There were a multitude of reasons that he could tack the blame on, particularly things like not having his coffee or having Hisashi yell in his ear at 6 in the goddamn morning, really anything. But no, today was different. It was because of Izuku Midoriya. Not only did he receive All Might's praise and catch several teachers' interest, but the praise wasn't unfounded. There was something about the kid that caused him to sigh every time he was mentioned. The boy seemed relatively normal at first, but no matter what he was doing, he looked incredibly bored. It was as if he didn't want to be there in the first place. Normally, Aizawa would attribute that trait to someone who didn't care about heroics. But from the singing praise All Might had offered, he couldn't believe it was true. Besides, he didn't have that air of arrogance about him that a lot of other potential heroes, and even pros, had. The kid had even caught Nizu's attention. He felt a bit sorry for him in that regard, but it was a feat in and of itself. Nobody but the mouse, and Aizawa of course, had noticed, but the boy was more than perceptive. He knew exactly what was going on around him, and he took in everything in an instant. That fact first reared its head when the boy had taken notice of Hisashi's position within mere seconds of hearing his voice. Now the man was loud, but he wasn't stupid in the least. Hisashi, when he wanted to, could hide himself. And, of course, there was the fact that his quirk made it seem as if his voice were coming from all directions if he was far away enough. If Midoriya had not only noticed the ever-so-slight difference in his voice but was also able to pinpoint where he was from such a small factor, the kid was something to behold. And, unlike the rest of the applicants, the boy had started the exam at Hisashi's first warning rather than the following ones. Of course, he had only strengthened Aizawa's suspicions when he knew every time, without fail, where the robot was. And that was before they even turned the corner. Or even reached the corner. Midoriya had also known where every person was, no matter how quiet they were being. And if anyone was in trouble, he'd immediately rush over, a bored expression plastered on his face while he tended to their injuries or got them out of trouble, hence why he had received a good amount of rescue points. And now there he was, walking into his classroom. Aizawa sitting on the floor in his sleeping bag, expecting nobody to notice him, as they never did, only to find that the one person who did was none other than Izuku Midoriya. He was going to be trouble. Izuku, upon walking into, almost immediately found himself overwhelmed. Normally, it wouldn't be so awful, but because of the school-wide first-day jitters, he felt a headache brewing in his mind. Still, not wanting to be late, he in a sharp breath and searched around for the stairs, heading up as soon as he found them. From there, it wasn't too difficult to find his classroom as he was able to pinpoint a few familiar fear signatures, as Quirk specialists caused them, and he wasted no time in pushing the door open. His eyes first flicked to the side upon realizing there was someone else not in the main part of the room, and they fell upon a yellow sleeping bag that a face peeked out from. Izuku didn't miss the slight surprise he saw in the man's eyes, but he wasn't able to ponder the situation further as he suddenly found himself with a chatty boy. "Ida," Izuku said simply. The boy's lip twitched upwards. "Hello, Midoriya. I'm glad you remembered my name." Almost robotically, he stuck his hand out, and Izuku's eyes lingered for a moment before he took the gesture. Both awkwardly moved their arms up and down before Ida finally dropped his hand with a nervous laugh. "Well, I wish you good luck in class today. I also commend you on finding the other aspect of the exercise." Izuku didn't waste any time. "What aspect?" Ida tilted his head curiously. Was I wrong? I'm referring to the rescue points. No, the freckled boy said, raising his shoulders in a half-hearted shrug. I didn't know about them. I was just trying to help. Ida blinked in surprise before laughing. Well, then you're even better than I had initially suspected. I admit, he said, rubbing the back of his neck as his expression slightly fell, I acted cowardly when I ran. It's fine, Izuku replied, waving him off. Everyone there was scared. You weren't the only one. Ida opened his mouth to thank him, but he was interrupted before he had the chance. Hey, I recognize that messed up hair. Plain kid, a girl said excitedly, running up to him. Oh, she blushed awkwardly. Sorry, I just didn't know your name. Izuku recognized her as the one he had saved during the exam. Uraraka, right? The girl blinked. Yeah. How'd you know? However, she didn't wait for his reply, instead continuing to happily bounce on her toes with a grin. Thanks though. I was kind of afraid that you might not get in. I'm glad you did though. She laughed nervously. I know I barely cut it, but... As Uraraka spoke, Izuku raised his head, looking between her and Ida to see Bakugo glaring at him. Once the freckled boy had noticed, the blonde gave a small scowl before looking away. Anyways, Uraraka caught his attention once again. What do you think we're doing besides orientation? I wonder what our teachers are like. I can't wait to meet everybody. Suddenly he heard someone clear their throat. Everyone's gazes slowly turned towards the man in the yellow sleeping bag, his figure causing most people to gape or stare nervously. If you're just here to make friends, then pack up now, he said, unzipping his bag slightly. Welcome to UA's hero course. Uraraka made a strained noise as he slurped a fruit pouch, but the man paid her no mind. It took 8 seconds before all of you shut up, he said. Standing up, that's not gonna work. Time is precious. Rational students would understand that. Izuku stared at the man, seeing that his eyes occasionally flicked towards him as well. The freckled boy narrowed his eyes slightly, trying to figure out where he'd seen him before. Not to mention, Aizawa looked towards the rest of the class, pointing at Izuku. Only one of you even noticed I was here. As heroes, you need to be more perceptive. Otherwise you'll get caught in the field. As he sighed, and once the rest of the class eyes were off of Izuku, he stepped forwards. Anyways, I'm Shota Aizawa. Your homeroom teacher. Oh, Izuku said suddenly. Aizawa's eye twitched. Have anything to share, Midoriya? I was just trying to figure out where I've seen you, he replied simply. Your Eraserhead. The man's eyes widened by a fraction before returning to their normal, lowered state. That's right. Congrats, you're the first to ever know this early. But next time try not to interrupt. Izuku gave a slight nod, and Aizawa continued, drawing the attention back towards himself. Right, let's get to it. He completely slipped out of his sleeping bag, showing a UA uniform as he walked towards the door. Put these on and head outside. The students of 1A exchanged confused glances before slowly nodding and heading to change. So, a boy with a lightning streak in his hair, sitting on a bench. Why do you think he's taking us outside? Maybe to lead us to orientation? Shiro offered. Ida shook his head. Then Aizawa-sensei would have allowed us to keep our uniforms on rather than switching to our gym outfits. You don't think, a short, purple-haired boy gulped, that he's planning something? Sada walked out after changing. Like, I don't know, he shivered, like, attacking us and killing us if we don't pass. He looks like the murdering type. The other boys stared at him as if they were dumbfounded by his stupidity, but Ida was quick to shake his head, placing his hand on his chin. There's no way he'd be that harsh. But I wouldn't discount him fully, Kaminari said, laughing nervously. He didn't seem all that friendly. Once Shiro noticed Izuku leaving the locker room, he caught him by the arm, awkwardly moving backward when the freckled boy stared at him but still speaking up. Sorry. Anyways, Midoriya, right? Izuku nodded. Well, you seem to know about him, he mentioned. What's he like? The freckled boy searched Shiro's eyes for a moment before shrugging. I don't know him personally, or anything. But from everything I know about him, he's a no-nonsense pro. After that, Izuku was quick to leave, and the other boys exchanged nervous looks. That, Kaminari sighed, slumping down and looking defeated. That can't be good. Nonsense, Ida said, waving him off, but he didn't seem so sure himself. Anyways, we should all get going. I'm sure Aizawa-sensei would appreciate proper punctuation. The boys let out a collective sigh before following Ida out the door, finding a good amount of people already outside. Strangely, Bakugo seemed to be eyeing Izuku, but the latter didn't seem to notice. Hey, Kaminari whispered to him, did you do something to tick him off or something? Izuku gave him a blank look. Maybe. Kaminari blinked confusedly as the freckled boy walked away, absent-mindedly wondering if he had said something rude when their homeroom teacher cleared his throat. You all need to learn how to get ready much faster if you want to be heroes, he said sharply, scanning the crowd and causing each student to straighten. After a moment, however, he sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. Anyways, we're going to do a quirk assessment test. Don't slack off. Uraraka sputtered. We're gonna miss orientation. Aizawa simply rolled his eyes. If you want to make it to the big leagues, you can't waste time on pointless ceremonies. Here at UA, he said sharply, we're not tethered to tradition. That means I get to run my class however I see fit. During the man's pause, Izuku raised his hand, but didn't wait to speak. And Principal Nizu just allows you to do that? From his reaction, that was the exact wrong thing to say. And what exactly do you mean by that? He asked, eyes narrowed. I mean it must be permitted, right? You probably do this every year, he casually mentioned, and judging by everything I know about you, you're a huge softie. You act like an unbreakable wall but enjoy cuddling kittens as much as everyone else. He scratched his chin, missing the blurted laughter from the side, annoyed eye twitching from Aizawa, and the gaping faces of his classmates. I mean that's what I assume, anyways. From how you handle all of your cases. Aizawa decided that he'd like to strangle this child, but instead ran his hand through his hair. All right, Midoriya. Since you're so keen on interrupting with this little theory of yours, let's try this. He paused for a moment, scanning the crowd as they held their breath. Whoever comes in last is expelled. Oh sheet, Kaminari blurted before slapping his hands over his mouth. Zero sighed. Why'd you have to go and tick him off? Bakugo's eye twitched, but he remained silent, and the rest of the class had similar, panicked reactions to the former two. Sure, Izuku responded, shrugging. Aizawa scowled but tossed the boy a ball. What was your farthest throw in middle school? He questioned. Probably 48 meters or so, Izuku replied, looking entirely uninterested. The score wasn't even remotely impressive, at least compared to the records of the other students, but the boy didn't seem to pay it any mind. Right? The man sighed. Try throwing the ball with your quirk. Anything goes as long as you stay in the circle. Izuku nodded, stepping forwards and slowly making his way into the circle. Hurry up, Aizawa said, you're wasting our time. The boy didn't pay him any mind, though, and simply stretched for a moment before throwing the ball forwards. Without his quirk. So it reached 52 meters. Aizawa's eye twitched. What was the dash? Izuku put his hand up, purple smoke drifting from his hand until it transformed into his trusty beast's. Without a word between the two, the monster understood its task and trotted over to the ball before picking it up in its jaws. Oh, Ida said, placing his hand on his chin. He must be planning to have his beast throw from there. Cool. Kirishima grinned. I want to see how far that thing could throw. Tsuyu put her finger on her chin, voicing a question. But then why didn't he make something more useful for throwing? Maybe that's the only thing he knows how to make? Mina suggested. No, I'm quite sure he's able to make other things, Ida commented. He began to open his mouth to speak once again when Kaminari suddenly snorted before doubling over in laughter. The class turned to the boy confusedly, and he continued wheezing as he shakily raised his hand to point towards Izuku. Look. And when they turned to see, each of their eyes nearly popped out of their heads, jaws lowered in bewilderment. Rather than throwing the ball, the beast picked it up as if it were a dog before trotting back to Izuku and dropping it in Izuku's hands. Good boy, he said in a monotone voice. and Mina nearly choked. Then, before anyone could say anything, Izuku threw the ball once again, and the two proceeded to have a game of fetch for the next 5 or so minutes, all of which everyone was too stunned to say anything. Midoriya, Aizawa finally said, eyes piercing through the boy's soul, "Are you just planning to waste our time here?" "No, I'm done," he said, dusting off his pants as if he didn't have a care in the world. "All right, bud, bring this over to Mom." The class watched incredulously as Izuku placed the ball in the beast's mouth, only for the creature to stretch its legs out before bounding in the opposite direction, moving so quickly that it appeared to be a sort of mist. "What was that?" Shiro finally asked once the beast had left the class site. Well," Izuku shrugged, "I'm having him run to my mom. She's actually at her job right now." He scratched his jaw, looking slightly up to the left. "She's probably in the next city right now." Hagakure sputtered. "What was the point of that game of catch, then?" Mineta shouted, asking the question that everyone else was thinking. Oh, he said, "Yeah, he's like a dog, I guess. He needs to be riled up first or he'll just sit there." "A dog?" Kaminari let out, blinking rapidly. Izuku nodded. "Yeah, just like one. That huge thing." Mina blurted, "Like a dog?" The freckled boy raised a brow. "You've never seen a big dog before?" He didn't bother waiting for a response before turning towards Aizawa. He should have stopped by now, right? "Can I step out of the circle now?" Aizawa didn't know where to begin, so he simply looked down before sighing. "Yes." He stopped. "All right," Izuku said, nodding as he stepped back to his class. "Guess my turn's over then." Uraraka turned towards her, confusion written all over her face. "Why'd you wait there?" "Aizawa-sensei did say you had to stay inside the circle," he replied simply. His classmates weren't quite sure what to make of him or his responses, but Aizawa knew exactly how to label the boy. He was, without a doubt, a problem child. And he'd need a whole lot of aspirin and vodka for this one. The rest of the tests turned out relatively normal, compared to Midoriya's little stunt. In all honesty, the class was kind of hoping something else would go hilariously wrong for a bit of added entertainment, but alas, Midoriya's quirk wasn't very helpful in the other tests. Which, unfortunately for him, is how he ended up at the bottom of the list. While the rest of the class looked over with variants of pity and sorrow in their eyes, Izuku's expression was carefully blank. "Anyways," Aizawa sighed, turning off the screen, "that was all just a logical ruse. None of you are going home." Izuku seemed to accept the fact easily, along with Yaoyorozu, but the rest of the class seemed to be freaking out in one way or another. Ida blurted, "There's no way that can be ethical." The man waved him off. "Nonsense. It was to ensure you gave your all in the tests." He carefully ignored Izuku's prying eyes and turned away to lead the class back inside. "Or," Kirishima chuckled, "you really are a softie, Aizawa-sensei." Aizawa paused for a moment before turning around with a terrifying intensity radiating from his piercing red eyes. "What was that, Kirishima? Do you think you're safe from expulsion just because you passed now?" The boy paled before shaking his head frantically. No, sorry Aizawa-sensei. Yeah." After scanning the crowd, Aizawa allowed his hair to fall around his shoulders, blinking before rolling his eyes. "We're done for the day. Pick up your syllabus in the classroom and read it over before tomorrow morning." The class chattered amongst themselves, some still jittery, and began to walk back inside to collect their things. Just as Izuku was about to follow, though, Aizawa placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "And you kid," he said, eyes narrowed, "although what you pulled was successful, please don't waste so much time again. You don't have time for that kind of thing in battle." Izuku blinked, and Aizawa briefly wondered if the kid really didn't get it. However, he bowed after a moment, nodding. "Sir, I apologize. I'll be quicker next time." Aizawa was left in a sort of stunned silence as the boy walked away, stomach churning with a familiar feeling. He immediately groaned, knowing what it meant. That kid was going to be the death of him. But he'd never admit the protectiveness over his especially bad problem children. Sighing to himself, Aizawa walked towards the side of the building and dropped a few eye drops in his eyes, only to notice All Might lingering by the side of the building. That was a pretty rotten move, he commented. You're here? He asked bluntly, looking entirely unimpressed. No talk shows today then? All Might did nothing but wear a sort of smug grin, one that ticked him off even more than his hero one. So you see his potential too, huh? Aizawa scoffed. Why does it matter to you? And anyways, he waved him off. The answer is no. It was just a rational deception, as I said. Likely story, the man chuckled, pulling himself from the wall. I read through your file. You've expelled entire classes before, and I'm sure you'd be willing to again. You were planning on sending last place home. So, he grinned, you must see the same potential in young Midoriya that I do. Already picking out favorites, huh, All Might? Aizawa said, walking away from the man. However, after a moment he paused and let out a sigh. I'll admit he doesn't have zero potential. If that were the case, I would have sent him straight home after class without hesitation. It's cruel to let a kid keep dreaming about something that will never come true. Leaving All Might to stand there. With a half-amused, half-surprised look, Aizawa groaned to himself. He seriously got himself in some deep shit. Whispers floated around the staff room, causing Aizawa to cautiously eye everyone as he stepped in. What's going on? He asked, a sharpness in his tone. Present Mike suddenly yelped, turning towards the man in a sort of bewilderment. However, beside him, Midnight stood, a smug grin spreading across her cheeks. So, Aizawa, I heard you've already earned yourself a problem child. Aizawa simply stared, wishing he could drop dead right there and then. So, she asked excitedly, practically jumping in his face, how bad is he? Awful, he simply replied, heading towards the coffee machine. Oh, come on, show, Present Mike whined, following after him like a puppy. Tell us about the little listener. Aizawa rolled his eyes. You already know who it is. While Present Mike straightened confusedly, Cementos spoke up. What do you mean? The man resisted the urge to sigh as All Might stepped in, grinning. It's none other than young Midoriya. Oh! Midnight exclaimed, more of this kid? What exactly happened? Vlad King questioned. Aizawa mixed several energy drinks into his coffee. The kid, he sighed, guzzling down the hellish concoction and half hoping a heart attack would take him, played a game of fetch with his quirk in the middle of my test. Present Mike snorted before slapping his hand over his mouth. What is that supposed to mean? Ectoplasm asked. All Might, helpfully, answered for him. Young Midoriya, as you might remember, can create nightmares from his quirk. One of his creatures is a large beast that has the mannerisms of a dog. When it became tangible, he chuckled, he began to use the ball throw as an attempt to play fetch. Cementos looked torn between amusement and confusion. And you just let him? Believe me, Aizawa groaned, I wanted to stop the kid. But before I could say anything, he finally took his turn. All Might grinned. Turns out, young Midoriya was riling the beast up so he'd run off with the ball elsewhere. How far did it get? Snipe asked. Aizawa blinked. About 10 kilometers. Present Mike nearly spit out the drink that he had grabbed. W-hoots. To be fair, All Might mentioned, another student got infinity with a gravity quirk. Young Midoriya's attempt was still quite impressive, though. Brought it all the way to the next city in a matter of minutes, Aizawa muttered, desperately wishing that he had brought his stash of alcohol. I can see why he's a problem child, Cementos commented amusedly. But why exactly were you two, he said, gesturing towards Midnight and Present Mike, teasing him about such a thing? Oh, Midnight smirked, and Aizawa slammed his face into his desk with a sigh. Well, when Sho finds a problem child, he inevitably becomes attached and the worst always ends up as his favorite student. Present Mike, similarly, grinned. If you couldn't tell by now, Sho's actually a huge soft dash. I will strangle you personally, Aizawa said coldly, causing the blonde to shrink as he glared at him. Anyways, he said awkwardly before returning to his normal, chipper self, what Nem said is right. Anything else? Ectoplasm asked curiously. Unfortunately, Aizawa answered grimly. I doubt any of you noticed, but the kid located Hisashi during the entrance exam in a matter of moments, and sensed the robots before they even came around the corner. And, he said, taking another swig of his heart attack inducer, he noticed and recognized me before I showed myself. Midnight blinked incredulously. Ah. Incredibly interesting, a new voice said, causing each teacher to freeze. I wonder if the boy would be interested in becoming my personal student. While the other teachers looked on in horror, Aizawa finished off the last of his coffee and muttered to himself, sinking to the ground and zipping himself in his sleeping bag. Goodbye, cruel world. Izuku sneezed before opening up his case and inspecting his costume. It held certain elements from the design he had as a kid, while also incorporating several new ideas and help for his quirk. He and his mother, after a brief mention of the costume, had stayed up all night together planning it. The boy stared at his costume, remembering the way that Inko had cheerfully smiled, tears dripping down her face as she voiced how proud she was for Izuku. He allowed the memory to stay in his mind for a moment before snapping out of it and scanning the design. While it retained the mask, it was far more practical and made of metal rather than plastic, along with the removal of the cheesy grin. Plus, there was the added component of a scarf that was eerily similar to Eraserhead's. However, while it would be still incredibly helpful in capturing villains, once he learned how to use it, the primary use was for him to be able to hold the villain just long enough to use his quirk. He did keep one specific part of the design, even if it was a bit tacky. While they weren't as odd as before, he, once seeing the look in Inko's eyes, decided to keep the bunny ears that connected to his hood. Besides that, the costume itself was an emerald green color, and he had tall, black boots rather than his normal red sneakers. A belt was also nestled within the box, with holsters on either side, one for aspirin, so he wouldn't become overwhelmed by fear, and the other holding a just-in-case knife. He wasn't exactly sure when the knee pads would be helpful, but he added them at his mother's request, as she worried about not having enough padding. Additionally, for better use of his quirk, he had a pair of fingerless gloves and his costume was short-sleeved with easily removed bandages, designed in such a way to allow the smoke to easily escape. For general practical use, though, the costume itself was quite durable, fireproof, at the suggestion of Inko, and it even had a sort of cooling factor that Izuku didn't quite understand. The point was the costume was perfect for him. And, when Izuku walked out for his heroics class, he was greeted by respecting grins, and he, in return, had a look at their costumes. Someone in a metal suit walked up to him as he glanced around, only showing their eyes while the rest of their body was covered. And, from the looks of the engines on the back, Izuku was certain that it was Ida. I must say, Midoriya, he said, confirming the freckled boy's thoughts, your costume is very well designed. Did you come up with the concept? Izuku shrugged. It was me and my mom. We decided to improve my old design together. His eyes flicked around the metal suit before he spoke up again. Yours is pretty cool too. Thank you, he beamed. It's based on my brother's. He froze momentarily. Ingenium? Izuku asked. That makes sense. Ida looked a bit nervous for a moment, even within the suit, but began to nod proudly. Yes, I look up to him and I'd like to assist him, one day. That's pretty admirable, a voice suddenly said, causing the boy in the metal suit to jump. Mina and Kaminari laughed at the clunk of metal and the admittedly shrill shriek that came from Ida, while Uraraka didn't seem to notice. Anyways, Deku, your costume is awesome too. She tilted her head before smiling. It's kind of vigilante-like. Izuku glanced down, inspecting himself. I guess so. If she was put off by his response, she didn't bother showing it. Instead, she and Ida continued chatting to him until All Might finally cleared his throat at the front of the class. Each student, still starstruck by his appearance in the first place, moved into a more organized group and turned towards the man. Now that everyone's ready, he said, grinning with his fists pressed against his hips, it's time for combat training. Sir, Ida suddenly said, raising his hand. Without waiting for a response, he asked his question. This is the fake city from our entrance exam. Does that mean we'll be conducting urban battles again? All Might chuckled, throwing up a peace sign. Not quite. I'm going to move you 2 steps ahead. He cleared his throat, putting his hand to the side. Most of the villain fights you see on the news take place outside. However, statistically speaking, run-ins with the most dastardly villains take place indoors. Think about it, All Might continued, backroom deals, home invasions, secret underground lairs. He held his clenched fist in front of his face. Truly intelligent criminals stay in the shadows. For this training exercise, he explained, you'll be split into teams of good guys and bad guys and fight 2-on-2 indoor battles. Izuku's eyes just barely narrowed as he noticed the purple smoke around All Might increase. Was All for One like that? He wondered. Tsuyu placed her finger on her chin, head tilting to the side. Isn't this a little advanced? Ribbit. All Might grinned, but the mist only grew. The best training is what you get on the battlefield. But remember, he reminded them, you can't just punch a robot this time. You're dealing with actual people now. Yaoyorozu raised her hand, though in a much more relaxed way than Ida did. Sir, will you be the one deciding who wins? Bakugo raised his head slightly, as if he were attempting to look down on everyone else. How much are we allowed to hurt the other team? Uraraka bit her lip, asking a question nervously. Do we need to worry about the losers getting expelled like earlier? Will you be splitting us up by chance or by comparative skill? Ida questioned. Aoyama winked, asking an entirely off-topic question. Isn't this cape just tray chic? All Might made a strangled noise, sighing. I wasn't finished talking. After a moment, though, he shook his head and pulled a booklet from his hands, causing the students around him to look surprised. Listen up, he said, gesturing as he explained. The situation is this. The villains have hidden a nuclear missile somewhere in their hideout. Their job is to protect it to their best ability. He cleared his throat, flipping the page. On the other hand, the heroes either have to catch the evildoers or recover the weapon to foil their plans. Likewise, the villains succeed if they protect their payload or capture the heroes. He raised his head with a grin, seemingly oblivious to the incredulous look of the class. Got it? After a moment of awkward silence, the students nodded their head in agreement, prompting All Might to pick up the box to his side and place it in front of him. Time's limited. We'll be choosing teams by drawing lots. Ida looked surprised. Isn't there a better way? Maybe, Yaoyorozu offered. It's an exercise to see how well we deal with being teamed up with those we have no knowledge about. After all, many pros often have to team up with other agencies without much warning. The boy nodded his head along to her explanation. I see. That makes sense. He dropped his hands to his sides, bowing in a perfect 90-degree angle. I apologize for my rudeness. All Might chuckled awkwardly before turning. No sweat. Let's draw. Ah, wait, Izuku suddenly said, catching All Might's attention. Are we allowed to use support items? The man blinked before grinning. Of course. Whatever you have on hand is a weapon, even if you use the building itself, he chuckled. All right, the boy nodded, thanks. All Might waved cheerfully before beginning to draw lots. Team A, he said, drawing two names and glancing down at the slips of paper, are Midoriya and Uraraka. Izuku shared a quick glance with Uraraka before turning back towards the front, where All Might continued drawing. Team B Shoji and Todoroki. While Shoji looked over at Todoroki, the latter didn't bother sparing a glance. Izuku stared at the scene for a moment, but ultimately decided to brush it off. Team C Mineta and Yaoyorozu. Mineta shot Yaoyorozu a perverted look, and the girl squirmed uncomfortably. Izuku couldn't help but notice the way that he looked at her, a cloud of fear beginning to grow around her. Team Deku and Ida. While Ida nodded and glanced over at his partner, Bakugo scoffed, not bothering to look over. Team Mina and Aoyama. Aoyama winked, while Mina gave a grin and a thumbs up. Team F Koda and Sato. Koda glanced nervously towards Sato, and although the latter seemed more confident, he wasn't exactly calm, especially after Koda's half-terrified look. Team Kaminari and Jiro. Kaminari grinned, and Jiro laughed to herself. Team H Tokoyami and Tsuyu. Tokoyami simply closed his eyes and nodded, while Tsuyu nodded. Team I Ojiro and Hagakure. Ojiro looked around for the girl, but seemed to struggle in finding her. Team J, Shiro and Kirishima. Shiro and Kirishima shared a grin and then a high five, with Kirishima proclaiming something about how manly this would be. All right. All Might grinned at the end, clapping his hands together. Now for the M-. All Might, Izuku interrupted, raising his hand once again. Yes, young Midoriya? All Might questioned. I don't think Yaoyorozu and Mineta should be partners, he stated bluntly, causing the boy to freeze. The girl, however, looked at him with a sort of gratefulness in her eyes. All Might was about to ask why, but when he noticed the drool dripping down Mineta's chin, he frowned. I see. The boy looked mildly offended, but the blonde paid him no mind. Would anyone be willing to be partners with Mineta? After a moment of silence, Ojiro sighed, and Hagakure was standing next to him, mentioning something about wanting to help Yaoyorozu, and it was fine if he wanted to leave. I guess I'll be his partner, the boy said. And, although he wasn't exactly rude about it, he didn't give Mineta a friendly welcome either. Mineta, similarly, seemed irritated by the turn of events, pouting to himself while Yaoyorozu and Hagakure made friendly chat. After a moment, All Might regained control of the class. Anyways, now that we're done with that, it's time to pick matchups. I declare that the first two teams will be. He began, bending down to fish in the boxes and shuffling his arms for a moment before pulling out the labeled teams, and, these guys. Izuku turned his head slightly, noticing how Bakugu stiffened before a scowl grew on his face. Team A will be the heroes, All Might said, likely oblivious to the younger blonde's annoyance, and Team D will be the villains. Everyone else can head to the monitoring room to watch. Yes, sir, the class replied in unison, all heading in the direction in which the man pointed. Izuku, Uraraka, Bakugu, and Ida, however, remained in place, waiting for further instruction. The freckled boy couldn't help but notice the eyes that pierced through him, but simply shrugged the feeling off, leaving Bakugu to simmer in his anger. Bad guys. All Might finally said, showing the teams where to go. You can go in and set up. In 5 minutes, the good guys will be let loose and the battle will start. As Bakugu and Ida walked into the building, the former with gritted teeth and the latter walking as proper as can be, All Might caught their attention. Young Ida, young Bakugu, he exclaimed, causing both to pause. The key to being successful in this challenge is to embody villainy. Think from the perspective of an evildoer. Got it, Ida simply replied. And, All Might mentioned, if things go too far, I'll step in. Ida nodded again. Understood. Bakugu, though, had an entirely different reaction. He raised his head, eyes flicking towards Izuku and Uraraka as they conversed on the side of the building, unconsciously clenching his fist. Fine, he finally let out through gritted teeth. Once they were at the top floor, Ida spoke up, sighing as he held his helmet under his arm. I know this is training, but it pains me to be aligning with criminal behavior. As he stepped up to the bomb, though, he dropped his concerns, knocking on the metal. So this is the weapon we must protect. Fake, of course, he affirmed. Hey! Bakugu let out, causing Ida to look over curiously. The blonde grinded his teeth together before continuing. Do you think Deku is even trying? Ida raised a brow. What do you mean? Of course he is. Then why, he growled out, does he treat everything like it's a effing game? I suppose I see what you mean, the boy said, tapping on his chin. However, I believe Midoriya just thinks differently. After all, he doesn't dash. He doesn't have goddamn emotions, I know, he spat. Whatever. As the blonde tried to walk away, Ida spoke up. Why is it that you seem especially angry when it comes to Midoriya? Bakugu stopped dead in his tracks, hand twitching. Hivenji knows why, he answered. Or he should. Before Ida could inquire further, Bakugu stalked off, waiting for the timer to start. Meanwhile, outside the building, Uraraka was rambling off to Izuku as she scanned the sheet in her hand. You think they expect us to memorize this building's floor plan? She asked, furrowing her brows in a mixture of defeat and frustration. It's so big. I doubt it, Izuku replied simply. Knowing Kaken, he probably thought to hide it on one of the upper middle floors, so we don't have to worry about scanning the bottom. Uraraka hummed in reply, smiling. Makes sense. She glanced over at the boy, attempting to make further conversation. Hey, why do you call him that anyways? Kaken, and he calls you Deku, right? Izuku nodded. We were childhood friends. Ah, she grinned, hyping herself up. It's like a fated battle between rivals. Though, she frowned, it kind of seems like he's always glaring at you. He doesn't like me, Izuku admitted without hesitation, surprising the girl. He thinks I'm useless. Hence the name, Deku. Well, that's not very friendly, she mumbled before gasping. Oh my god, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was something bad. The boy shrugged. I don't mind. She sighed. I still don't think it's right. I figured it was some sort of name praising you. But I can do it. But, she frowned, it seems kind of wrong to say now. Before Izuku could reply, she shook her head. But anyways, do you think that I don't mind thing makes him angrier? She asked curiously. Not that it's fair in the first place. Izuku didn't have the chance to ask what she meant, since All Might activated his earpiece a moment later. All right, he announced, let's begin the indoor combat training. Team A and Team D. He paused. Your time starts now. Just as he announced for them to start, Izuku turned towards Uraraka. Can you float people? She smiled awkwardly, tilting her hand from side to side. I can, but I get sick a lot easier. The boy nodded, but glanced up and pointed to a window a few stories above them. Do you think you could at least get yourself up there? Uraraka squinted, biting her lip. I think so? Yeah. I'd say so. I might need a breather, though, she admitted. Izuku hummed. Then maybe we'd be better off using Kage first. The girl tilted her head curiously. Kage. The shadow I usually use, he responded. Oh, she brightened, like from the ball throw? Izuku nodded, taking off his glove. This'll only take a second. Oh, and, he mentioned, hang on tight. Uraraka didn't have time to ask questions, as the two found themselves being lifted off the ground. The girl startled, but her shoulders relaxed when she saw how calm Izuku was. In a way, his indifference was somehow comforting. Within a few moments, the two were only a few windows below their intended target. All right, Izuku said, glancing over at her, do you think you can take us from here? The plan seemed to dawn on Uraraka, and she grinned while standing. She let out a slight gasp once she almost fell, but Izuku was able to catch her. Oh, she blushed, staring at him, thanks. He simply nodded, pulling her back straight onto her feet. Let's go then. Uraraka didn't waste any more time, instead returning his nod and tapping him with her fingertips. Slowly, he began to rise, and she found herself almost immediately struggling to keep him afloat. Maybe, she thought to herself, this wasn't a great idea. You're doing great, Izuku suddenly said, causing her eyes to widen. Just a bit more. The girl blushed and offered a smile, somehow finding it easier to float the freckled boy the rest of the way up. And as soon as he latched onto the window, she pressed her fingers together, mumbling a release to herself before letting out a sigh. Do you need to catch your breath? Izuku asked. She almost laughed at the way it sounded when such a monotone voice attempted to yell, but she coughed it away and gave a thumbs up. I'm good. With that, she took in a deep breath, raising herself in the air. The lack of gravity, she admitted, was a bit unsettling, but she luckily, for her, the puke threatening to push through her mouth was distracting her from any possible fates. Gotcha, Izuku said, and Uraraka felt a pull on her arm. Just as she floated next to the window, he pulled her in, allowing her to quickly release herself and choke out a thanks. It's fine, he replied quickly, straightening himself at the sound of explosions. Kaken's here. Uraraka's eyes widened, and she stumbled to her feet. What should we do? Before the boy could reply, he was forced to leap to the side, rolling away towards Uraraka as Bakuga's explosion impacted the wall. A slight gasp escaped her lips, but Izuku was quick to stand and put his hand on her shoulder. Go find Ida. I'll deal with Kaken, he said quietly. But she began, but Izuku shook his head. He's going to go after me anyway. This'll be better for both of us. Although uneasy, Uraraka gave a hesitant nod and, while Izuku jumped out of the way again, she used the smoke as cover and began to make her escape, wincing at each explosion and swear in the distance. "You!" Bakugo shouted, hands on his legs as he stood opposed to the boy, smoke clearing from the room. Both caught their breath, but while the blonde gritted his teeth, Izuku looked positively bored. "I knew you'd come for me," he said simply. The blonde snarled, eyes narrowing. "Goddamn it, Deku!" Bakugo barked, throwing his right fist forwards. "Why don't you even care?" Izuku didn't reply, instead stepping to the side and grabbing Bakugo's arm, catching the blonde by surprise. Without warning, he flipped him over his shoulder, slamming him to the ground and causing spit to fly from Bakugo's lips while he sparked off panicked explosions. "W," he sputtered with wide eyes. "How?" "You always start with a right hook," Izuku said, standing over the boy as he breathed heavily. "I figured it'd be the same as always." Bakugo gritted his teeth. "How would you even know, you apathetic bastard?" he shouted, pushing himself back to his feet with his explosions, creating distance between the two boys at the same time. Izuku stood straight, rolling his shoulders. "I've watched you for years, Kaken. Don't you remember my hero notebooks?" The blonde froze. "You couldn't have. Did you think that was for nothing?" he questioned. And, although it held no trace of malice, Bakugo couldn't help but feel like his words were venomous. "I've always wanted to be a hero." The blonde then stared in a shock for a moment, but his expression quickly twisted into one of rage. "Deku," he growled. "You never seem to care. You never even effing try," he shouted, hands shaking with anger. That's why I hate you. Kaken and I have known each other since we were kids. After growing up so close together, it was impossible for us not to interact. He was my best friend. Come on." Bakugo grinned, hands on his hips. "Let's go in." "Ah." Izuku shifted nervously. "Are you sure, Kaken?" The boy rolled his eyes. "Of course, you don't have anything to worry about if I'm with you in the first place. Anyways," he grinned, pumping his fist into the air, "let's go find bad guys." All of the other neighborhood kids followed him, too. He was strong and everyone could see that. It always seemed like he could do anything. Bakugo waved for everyone to follow as he led them through the gates. A bright grin spread across his cheeks. And no matter what he decided to do, he was always filled with confidence. "When I was young, I thought he was the coolest person I've ever met." With a small smile on his face, Izuku ran after the others, laughing along as Bakugo teased him playfully. However, Bakugo's fingers twitched, sweat dripping from the tips as his scowl deepened. When his quirk manifested, he started to change. The blonde raised his head, taking in a deep breath as his eyes pierced through Izuku. The freckled boy, however, didn't seem to care at all. "You don't seem to care about anything. You never even try. Even with your goddamn quirk, you never effing try." He heaved, hands curling into his fists. That's why I hate you." Izuku remained perfectly still, which only seemed to make the boy angrier. He did always have a sort of overconfident personality, the freckled boy supposed. He never would have figured it'd throw him so far from grace, though. Bakugo suddenly stiffened, slapping his hand to his receiver. "Just shut up and defend the weapon," he roared, voice cracking. "I've got more important things to worry about." A frustrated "Baku" was heard on the other line before it went dead, and the two could regain their focus on the battle. Izuku's hand hovered over the capture tape that was attached to his belt, waiting for the blonde in front of him to attack. "Your little stunt was a decent move," he growled, lunging forwards. "But if you keep acting like effing dunce, there's no way you'll win. You can't take me alone." The blonde's eyes suddenly widened once he realized that Izuku was swiftly wrapping the capture tape around him, and he gritted his teeth before punching the wall with an explosion. With the brief smoke screen, Bakugo was able to leap away, kicking the tape from his foot. "You're switching up your moves," Izuku said simply, straightening himself. "Glad you fucking noticed," the blonde spat, a bitter look on his face. He took in a deep breath before rolling his shoulders and launching himself towards the boy once again. Let's see if your half-ass technique can stop me now. Izuku, much to Bakugu's annoyance, simply ducked, forcing the blonde to come to a rolling stop on the ground, turning around as his eye twitched. The freckled boy backed up, noticing that he was in a tight corner. Kaken's just running on anger. If they wanted to win, they would have been better off sending out Ida while Kaken protected the weapon. So clearly, he thought, making eye contact with the blonde, he came here of his own will. Without Ida's input. Goddamn it, Deku. Bakugu, standing shakily, for years you've acted like nothing but a pebble. You only ever do what's easiest so you can pass. He breathed heavily, raising his arm. Let's see you go all out for once, huh? The blonde's earpiece suddenly crackled with a voice. Young Bakugu. All Might yelled, don't. You'll kill him. Bakugu snarled in reply. He can dodge. He's just acting like a DMN weakling. Before All Might could protest further, he threw his earpiece to the ground, facing Izuku. Now show me what you've got. Izuku glanced to the side, seeing that he didn't have anywhere to go and being completely oblivious to the blonde's emotions. I need to end this quickly so I can get to you, Raraka. Then it'll be a 1-on-2 fight, a situation much more in our favor. Pay the attention. Bakugu yelled with a dark grin, or you'll end up on the ground. He lowered his arm slightly. Just use your goddamn quirk and show me that you're not a worthless loser. Stop acting like some good-for-nothing that doesn't try his best. Without hesitance, Izuku let out a simple, no. Bakugu's eye twitched. What do you mean no? I won't use my quirk, Kaken, he replied. Why the not, Deku? He demanded. The freckled boy shook his head, breathing heavily from the constant movement. Because Kaken's too big. He'd destroy everything. The blonde roared. Bullshit. I know you can create other people's worst nightmares. Right, DKU? The louder his voice became, the more it cracked. So what do you think mine is? Izuku held his ground, the voices of his classmates calling out, villain, repeating in his mind. I'm not doing that, Kaken. No matter how angry you are, I won't. Fine. Bakugu spat, heaving, have it your way, Deku. Without giving the freckled boy a chance to process his words, he straightened his arm and flexed his palm before pulling the pin on his costume's grenade in one fluid motion. You better fucking dodge, he breathed out. Izuku, as usual, didn't feel any fear. However, that didn't keep him from having some semblance of self-preservation, and he found himself ducking and rolling to the side in an attempt to avoid Bakugu's blast. Of course, however, he didn't escape unscathed. He breathed heavily, wincing as he touched the burn on his leg pants having been torn during the battle beforehand. He attempted to force himself upwards, only to find that he kept falling back to the ground. Bakugu slowly stalked over to the boy, a scowl on his face. You're still trying to be lazy, huh? He spat, grabbing Izuku by the collar. Why won't you try? You're supposed to be my goddamn competition. A range of emotions crossed his face, but Izuku was oblivious to them all. The blonde let out ragged breaths, heart beating rapidly in his chest. Deku! Bakugu barked, fingers stuck in Izuku's face. What are you playing at, huh? Izuku simply blinked, backing away. What are you talking about? The blonde gritted his teeth, dropping his hand and clenching it into a fist. What the F is wrong with you? It's like I'm talking to a goddamn brick wall. Why can't you understand anything? The freckled boy didn't speak, instead figuring that Bakugu was, once again, angry about his uselessness. Bakugu studied the boy's eyes slowly narrowing. Something flickered behind the rage, but Izuku couldn't quite place what it was. Goddamn it. You don't even understand what I'm saying now, do you? He slapped his hands over his eyes, letting out an angry shout. Deku, he breathed out, lowering his hands, I'm going to beat you. You better stop pulling these ridiculous stunts and knock it off with your half-butted work. I want a real fucking challenge, not to fight some lowly bug. Once he realized that Izuku still didn't seem to get it, the boy scowled and turned. Never mind, then don't even bother trying. Just stay out of my effing way. He muttered under his breath as he walked away. You shouldn't have applied for UA in the first place. Why didn't you take my advice, dim nerd? Bakugo shouted, gritting his teeth. Izuku didn't even wince. Bakugo walked past the crowd of his classmates and led to himself. His eyes repeatedly flicked towards Izuku, anger coursing through his veins and only amplifying with each glance. He just didn't care. He was sick of seeing the nerd being so useless. He wasn't scared of Izuku. Not like everyone else. Unlike what Izuku thought, he wanted Izuku to be strong. To be some sort of challenge for Bakugo rather than a pebble in his path. But he wouldn't FING try. He just kept messing around with his ridiculous pets and doing crappy party tricks with his weird but smoke instead of being useful ones. And it more than set Bakugo off. After all, what's the use of thinking of someone as a rival if they didn't even care? If they didn't even see you as a rival? So, Bakugo finally decided as he watched Deku chat with his stupid friends that he would give up on the DMN nerd. He wouldn't bother trying to spark any sort of rivalry, wouldn't try to rile him up, get him to compete with him. He may have gotten second place in the entrance exams, but that was the end of Izuku's effort. He'd probably just laze around UA and cruise through as far as he could without trying. It seemed like he was trying to make Bakugo mad, no matter how ridiculous it sounded. Bakugo was going to be strong. With or without Deku. At least that's what he told himself. But whenever he saw that blank look on Izuku's face, he couldn't help but feel rage bubbling up within him. He couldn't help but remember the boys' dreams of becoming a hero, of their plans to work together. How he was throwing it all away. Kaken, Izuku had said when they were young, I hope when I get my quirk, it'll be just as strong as yours. Bakugo rolled his eyes but kept a grin on his face nevertheless. You're right there. I'll always be stronger. But, the boy asked hopefully, we'll still work together, yeah? The blonde stared at him for a moment before waving him off. Yeah, maybe you'll be lucky enough to be my sidekick or something. He held a secret smile on his face as he watched Izuku happily bounce around, mumbling about how they could work together. And then Izuku's quirk manifested. Deku, Bakugo yelled out, panting as he came to a stop. What's going on? Izuku barely looked up, tears in his eyes as he panted. Kaken, he whimpered. Shadows loomed over the boy as he curled up in on himself, unable to escape. In response, Bakugo gritted his teeth. Whatever, nerd, he shouted, running forwards. I'll save you. Izuku gasped as the blonde neared him, yelling for him to stop or he'd get hurt. Bakugo, however, ignored his protests, instead shooting off his explosions towards the shadowy creatures before snatching Izuku from the ground and running away with him. Come on, in it, he yelled, ignoring his rapid heartbeat. Eventually, the two stopped, exchanging a glance before collapsing onto the grass. Kaken, the freckled boy asked tearfully, why did you save me? Bakugo said, raising a brow as his chest went up and down rapidly. What do you mean? Izuku sat up, biting his lip as his eyes watered. You didn't have to help. The blonde replied, sitting up as well and looking away. After a moment, though, he spoke up. We're gonna be heroes together, remember? I can't just go and let my sidekick die. Izuku's eyes widened, and before Bakugo could say another word, he leapt towards the boy and tackled him into a hug, giggling as he cried. Thank you, Kaken. The blonde let out surprisedly, body tense. However, while Izuku happily sobbed into his shoulder, he reached his hands behind his friend's back. Yeah, whatever, Deku. But, come on, Deku. Bakugo exclaimed, let's play heroes. Izuku simply hummed in reply. Okay. The blonde's smile slightly fell at his friend's stoicism, but he shook it off. After all, it was becoming more and more of a regular occurrence. Alright, since I'm always All Might, you can be him for once. He placed his hands on his hips as if he was doing the boy the world's greatest favor. You're welcome. Cool, he replied, causing Bakugo to stiffen. Okay, he mumbled before straightening. Anyways, he said, pointing towards their two other friends, they're endangered citizens, and I'm the villains. You gotta save 'em. Izuku nodded, and Bakugo ran off and rambled on about his evil plans, only to see that the freckled boy seemed utterly disinterested. Something sparked inside of the blonde. What it was, though, he wasn't sure. "I'm here," he said, standing in front of Bakugo. "I'll stop you." Bakugo put on a grin, attempting to rile Izuku up. "Like you could All Might. I'll defeat you, after all, I'm the best villain the world's ever seen." "I can still stop you," Izuku replied with the same monotone voice that made Baku's heart fall. "Please, citizens, step back." The blonde's eye twitched, but he attempted to remain in character, getting into position for battle. "Let's go, All Might." Izuku nodded, copying the boy's stance. "All right." With a smirk, Bakugo launched himself forwards, throwing his hand forwards. "Eat this." The freckled boy ducked, and although the blonde was surprised, he was happy that Izuku was finally getting into it. "You can't dodge forever, All Might," he announced. "Oh, sorry," Izuku said, causing the blonde to do a double take. "What?" His friend shrugged. "I didn't know I wasn't allowed to dodge." Bakugo furrowed his brows, restating his question as his arms fell to his sides. "Huh? Is there something wrong?" Izuku asked. The blonde's mouth remained open for what seemed like hours, some sort of anger building inside of him. He felt like Deku was just messing with him, acting like he was some stupid weakling. "No," Bakugo finally replied, turning away. "I'm done now. I've got to go home." "Oh, all right," Izuku said, falling into his normal stance. "Bye, Kaken." Bakugo hoped it was just some sort of phase, but when he asked Inko, she told him that was just how Izuku was now. Apparently, it was his quirk's fault. Bakugo didn't buy it. After all, how could a quirk make you stop caring about everything? So he became angry. Angry that the demon nerd wouldn't ever give it his all, wouldn't ever put in an ounce of effort. And yet, somehow, he had always come out on top, even if the teachers did always make sure it appeared that Bakugo did, much to his annoyance. His rage only deepened as the years went by, with Izuku growing more apathetic with each growing day. Bakugo didn't even bother protecting him from the bullies anymore. It wasn't like Deku cared, anyway. He stopped talking to him like a friend, too. After all, this wasn't his Deku. It was some imposter that had replaced him. A fake. Bakugo was broken out of his thoughts once he noticed the smoke drifting from Izuku's hands. His eyes widened as he leapt backwards, watching as it grew into another version of Izuku. "Kaken," it said in a warbled voice, masking the real Izuku with its smoke. "How come you left me to die? Are you that weak?" Bakugo stepped back, throat becoming dry as the creature inched forwards. "Deku." Slowly, more forms appeared by his side. "Weak," they all chanted. "Useless. Stupid. Disgusting." "I just wanted to be saved, Kaken," he whispered. "Isn't that what you said you'd always do? You said we'd be heroes together, Kaken. Why'd you let me disappear?" His voice became sharper and less intelligible, voice seeming to pierce through the air and causing Bakugo's ears to bleed. The blonde gritted his teeth and pressed his hands to the sides of his head, attempting to block out the noise. "You just left me alone, Kaken," the shadow shrieked. "Weren't we supposed to be FRS?" Bakugo's chest heaved up and down, hand flying to his lips as a sour bile rose in the back of his throat. He attempted to squeeze his eyes shut, only to find that they refused to close. Gargled insults and shrill shrieks filled the air, and it became suffocating. The blonde watched, horrified, as the shadows fell together into an amalgamation of all of their bodies. "What the F dash dot," he whispered, stepping back with wide eyes. "Gee, get away from me." He felt the world become silent as the shadow towered over him, still spitting out distorted nonsense. "Kaken," Izuku's shadow whispered, returning to normal physically but keeping a distorted tone that caused the blonde's heart to fall. "Why did you just leave me alone?" "I didn't," he shouted back, falling to the ground and grasping at his scalp. I just dash." The shadow loomed over him, darkness seeming to swallow him whole. "Lie. You useless coward. No dash." "How about," it said, starting in a whisper before its voice rapidly rose in pitch, becoming near intelligible. "You just take ASWANDIV off the roof?" The smoke crashed into him like a tidal wave, and Bakugo found himself gasping for air on the ground. His lungs felt as if they were burning, and his eyes watered with each stinging buzz. He knew those words. He hadn't ever spoken them, but he had thought them. About Deku. Tears dripped down his cheeks as he panted, pupils having transformed into slits. His heart drummed and his breaths were too quick, his vision becoming blurred. "Kaken," a voice said. "No," Bakugo whispered, pushing himself backwards and attempting to study his heartbeat. "Stay the F away from me." "Kaken," it said again. "Oh," he shouted back. The voice paused for just a moment, and Bakugo held his breath. "Kaken," it repeated more softly, causing Bakugo's blood to run cold. He slowly raised his head, watching as the purple smoke faded from his vision. Izuku, the real Izuku, stood above him, extending his hand. "This is why, Kaken," he said. Bakugo blinked. "What?" he asked in a cracked voice, causing him to wince. "Everyone at school always called me a villain," he answered. "This is why. It's because my quirk isn't your average hero's power, Kaken. It's a literal nightmare." The blonde stared at him for a moment, blinking dumbly. "You mean? I know I made you angry. You're always mad about how useless I am. That's part of the reason I was trying so hard. I may not be able to feel anymore, but..." He paused. "I remembered what you said. About us becoming heroes. And that seemed like a pretty good future to me." "What?" Bakugo asked breathlessly, still trembling. "Deku, I don't fucking hate you because you're useless." Izuku may not have been able to be surprised, but he sure looked it. "I told you, I hate you because you never try." "But I do," he replied, a sort of rare confusion on his face. "I analyze every hero I see. I study heroics as much as possible. I even studied you." Bakugo blinked. Then again. And again. And then he found himself doing something he seriously hadn't expected. Without any warning, for either of them, he burst out into a fit of laughter, even as his body racked with sobs. "Kaken?" Izuku asked confusedly, "Are you all right?" "God damn it, Deku," he mumbled shakily, running his hands through his hair. "We're both fucking stupid." Izuku tilted his head to the side. "Looks like neither of us know how to read a room," he finally said, breathing out his last, rattly chuckle and closing his eyes. "I wasn't mad at you because you were useless. It's because I thought you gave up on your dream." Dream. He rolled his eyes, fingers twitching. "But it looks like you didn't do that, so now I feel kind of." He paused, struggling to find the word before one appeared in his mind. His face soured, and Izuku helpfully provided one. "Stupid." Bakugo snorted, though it sounded just a bit offended. "Yeah. But," he said with a sly grin, gaining a rosier complexion, "you are too shitty nerd. And," he shrugged as if it were the most obvious thing, "I'm at least better than you." Izuku looked up, and it seemed as if he were deep in thought. "I can accept that," he finally said. And, although there was no trace of humor in his words, Bakugo couldn't help but crack a smile. The two remained in a sort of calm silence until, finally, the buzzer rang. All Might's voice came in over the speakers, and he awkwardly coughed before continuing. "The match has ended. In a draw." Izuku Midoriya, recovery girl, greeted him with a sigh. "Please come in." The boy nodded, speaking as he sat on a cot. "How do you know my name?" "Believe me, teachers talk," she muttered to herself. "With All Might's praise and Aizawa's dread, I was sure you'd end up here sooner than later. Anyways," she said, turning around in her chair, "what brings you here in the first place?" The boy looked down, digging through his pocket before handing her the note that All Might had given her. After reading it over, she snorted. "Figures he wouldn't bring you here himself, even after an exercise." "And," she asked, raising her head, "it says here that you were burned?" He replied, pulling up his pant leg and showing it off. By that point, some of the blisters had gone down, but it still wasn't pretty. Recovery girl pursed her lips and hopped out of her chair. "How'd this happen?" "It was Kaken's quirk combined with a support weapon," he answered. She bent down, taking a look at the burn. "I don't know who Kaken is." But I assume this was an accident due to misuse? Oh no, he replied bluntly. He did it on purpose. It would have been worse if I didn't dodge. The woman paused. Excuse me? He waved it off. It's fine, we made up. You hero course kids, she sighed, clearly still a bit suspicious, are gonna be the death of me. Izuku didn't reply as she used her quirk on his leg, a soft glow emanating from his skin before the burns seemed to fizzle away. He blinked, wiping his hand over the now unscathed spot. Thanks. It is my job, she simply said before speaking up again. Now, just so you know, you'll feel a bit tired now. That dash. Yeah, your quirk is pretty interesting, he interrupted, still staring at where the burn used to be. It takes the target's stamina in return for healing injuries. Though I believe they could die if too much is taken, he said without even looking up. I know it can't regrow lost body parts or heal mortal injuries, but it's still impressive. Recovery blinked. Exactly. Anyways, Izuku said, finally raising his head, am I okay to go? HM? Oh yes, she replied, nodding and hoping that Nizu wasn't about to take over the world with this kid. You should be fine. Just don't overexert yourself for the rest of your day. I don't want you passing out in the middle of class. Izuku nodded, bowing before heading out the door. Thank you, ma'am. No problem, Sonny, she responded, waiting for him to leave before sighing once again. I see what you mean, Eraser. Are you all right, Midoriya? Uraraka asked, panicking as him and Bakugo came back. She darted around, inspecting him for injuries. Did that bully hurt you too much? Bakugo scowled from his side, but didn't bother saying anything. Kaken's fine, Izuku said, and so am I. He blinked, remembering how Ida had mentioned something about her puking. Are you okay? Huh, she said confusedly. After a moment, though, she nodded. Oh yeah, I was just a little sick is all. Otherwise, she grinned, I'm all good. Oh! Mina exclaimed upon noticing him and Bakugo, they're back. Izuku didn't bother replying, instead keeping his head low. Hey Bakugo, Kirishima said, grinning as he playfully elbowed the blonde. You looked pretty scary in there, but you came around, I see. Guess you're not all that bad after all. Speak another word to me and you're dead, shitty hair, he said in a venomous tone. The boy slightly paled, stepping backwards. Sorry, man. Bakugo simply rolled his eyes and walked away, hands in his pockets. Anyways, Midoriya, Hagakure bounced next to him. That was so cool. Oh my god, yeah. Mina exclaimed. You took down Bakugo. Izuku raised a brow. Why are you talking to me? Both girls seemed to deflate. Huh. Kirishima looked a bit annoyed. Hey man, wasn't that kinda rude? What do you mean? He asked with a blank face. Why wouldn't you want us to talk to you? Siro questioned. Huh. Izuku let out. I didn't say that. I'm just asking why you're doing it. Kaminari looked over at the boy. Why does it matter? Izuku shrugged. Whenever someone sees me use my quirk, they usually avoid me after that. Call me a villain, throw my stuff away, leave red spider lilies on my desk, stuff like that. With each word, the group around him looked progressively more horrified. Bakugo, however, had a sort of grim and guilty look on his face, though it wasn't entirely visible for those who weren't looking. That's awful, Uraraka muttered. So unmanly, Kirishima agreed, eyes more pointed than normal. Ida, who had come to greet Izuku but found himself in the middle of the crowd, looked incredibly offended. What kind of classmates could do such a thing? Izuku's expression remained blank. It's fine. I don't care. Midoriya, Ida frowned. Just because you don't have emotions doesn't mean it's okay. Yeah, Mina agreed, pounding her fist in her hand and looking annoyed. Whoever said that is getting it. I'll admit, Ojiro shook his head, your quirk was a little scary, but everything else is just too much. I mean, your quirk doesn't make you a bad person. Exactly. Hagakure reaffirmed, gloves showing in a way that made it seem like her arms were crossed. I appreciate having another wielder of the darkness to converse with, Tokoyami said, leaning against the wall. Anyways, Midoriya, Jiro finally said, sighing, we're not gonna treat you different because of your quirk. That's just ridiculous. Izuku blinked. Oh, is there something wrong? Uraraka asked. No, he replied slowly. I don't think anyone's ever cared before. After a moment, though, he added, except my mom. Bakugo could admit to feeling a bit guilty at that point. Well, Mina exclaimed happily, now you have friends. The boy mumbled, thanks then. The pink girl raised her brows after a moment, her new expression showcasing that she was clearly unimpressed. Though I will admit, we're going to have to work on that whole issue with social cues. Sorry, he said in his monotone voice, which only caused the class to burst into hysterics, leaving a very confused All Might standing behind them as he waited to end their lesson. Although Izuku wasn't exactly sure of what was going on, he was sure that his smiling faces and laughter around him weren't meant to be bad, unlike what he was accustomed to. And as his eyes raised to look at the ceiling, he thought of his mother. You hear that, Mom? Maybe that dream of being a hero isn't so far-fetched after all. Shoyuta Aizawa had a simple relationship with life that mainly consisted of doing the following: teacher work, hero work, drinking coffee, napping, and petting cats. However, now there was a newly introduced variable. None other than the problem child himself, Izuku Midoriya. Hey Shu, Hisashi voiced, smirking at Shoyuta as the blonde slunk around the corner. Shoyuta blinked, unimpressed by whatever the man was trying to do. What do you want? He replied gruffly, slipping his fingers through his mug's handle. He put the mouth of the cup against his lips, drinking his Heartstopper Special, name courtesy of Nemuri, and raising a brow. Hisashi grinned, and Shoyuta definitely didn't appreciate the flicker of mischief in his eyes. The black-haired man lowered his mug and narrowed his eyes. Get on with it, he said annoyedly. Well, I just wanted to ask how your son was, Hisashi responded offhandedly, feigning a look of innocence. Shuta's eyes twitched. My what now? Cementos and Snipe peered around from their desks, exchanging looks before turning back towards whatever drama they hoped would transpire. You know, Nemuri smirked, stepping from behind the blonde man, your little problem child. Shoyuta stiffened. What the F did he do this time? Snipe looked away, hand flying up to his, currently unmasked, face as he suppressed a snort. Why do you assume that what he did was bad? Power Loader asked curiously, peeking from over his station. Vlad King raised a brow. Says you, aren't you always complaining about some handsome girl? The man visibly paled. Fair enough. Aizawa resisted the urge to pinch the bridge of his nose, wondering just when his life had become some crappy soap opera, drama, or whatever you wanted to call it. His coffee was still hot. Maybe he could pour it on himself and die from his burns. Or the heart attack would finally come through for him. Either way, he wouldn't have to deal with whatever was going on. Well, All Might told us Hisashi began, and Shuta's eyes snapped towards the man before the voice hero could continue. His hair slowly floated into the air, tangling itself as his eyes glowed a deep, crimson red. What exactly did he tell you? Toshinori stiffened before laughing nervously. His laughter, though, soon devolved into awkward coughs when no one spoke up. Air. What is it? Shoyuta growled. The blonde forced a cough into his hand. Well, young Midoriya. Seemed to take some inspiration from you. Shuta's hair fell back around his shoulders as his brows furrowed, eyes returning to their normal shade of charcoal gray. What? Can I tell him? Hisashi asked, bouncing on his toes like an excited child. I'm gonna tell him. He turned towards Shoyuta, a smug look on his face and his hands on his hips. He has Eraserhead's scarf as part of his costume. The man nearly choked on the sip of coffee he had taken. What? He let out. Ectoplasm, great. The more the merrier, spoke up. Aren't the components of his capture weapon a secret? The surprise, aka, barely widened eyes, from Shuta's face dissolved and was replaced by narrowed eyes and gritted teeth. Yes, they are. Actually, Power Loader mentioned, scratching his head, I think that kid came into the support class asking about him. I let him know that I wasn't allowed to tell him anything about it, but... Shuta's eye twitched. But what? Where was his heart attack when he needed it? The man looked a bit surprised, one hand placed on the bottom of his chin. Well, a few days later he came in with his own design. Mentioned something about his notebook. He furrowed his brows for a moment before nodding to himself. Yeah, he said he watched your fights to figure out what kind of stuff your capture weapon was made from. Since he provided the blueprints himself, we couldn't really deny him. Power Loader finished, shrugging. Shoyuda blinked. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to know how the kid obtained any fights of himself, let alone ones that were clear enough to get more than a rough idea about his capture weapon. He figured it out himself? Nemuri asked, a slow look of surprise twisting into her features. Oh God, she muttered, nobody tell Nizu. Tashinori chuckled to himself, running his hand through the limp lasagna noodles that he called hair. I knew the kid was smart, but... Shoyuda paused for a moment before turning around and sliding open one of his desk drawers. What are you doing? Nemuri asked confusedly, trying to look over his shoulder. The man didn't reply, instead pulling out a flask and unscrewing the top, ignoring the other teacher's concerned looks as he began to pour the liquid into his mug. Sho? Hisashi said worriedly, don't you think that's enough? Shoyuda continued pouring for several more seconds before finally screwing the cap back on, placing the flask inside the desk and pushing it closed. What was in there? Tashinori muttered questioningly. Hisashi blinked. Vodka. The teachers watched, horrified, as Shoyuda slowly tilted the mug upwards and drank the satanic liquid relentlessly until he had drained every last drop. Once finished, he set it back down on the desk, wiped his top lip, and sat in his chair. I think we broke him, Nemuri mumbled, brows raised as everyone watched him bury himself into his desk and let out a sigh so long that God himself said, yikes. Hey, Ida, Uraraka greeted cheerfully, sliding in the seat next to Izuku. Congrats on your presidency. Ah, he replied, just barely blushing, thank you. I believe Midoriya deserved it more, though. Uraraka gave a slight laugh. Yeah, I thought he'd be good too. I didn't really expect him to pawn it off on you so quickly, Ida. She playfully elbowed Izuku, grinning. How come you did that anyways, Midoriya? After a moment of silence, both of his friends looked over, shooting him concerned glances when they noticed the uncomfortable look on his face. Is something wrong? Uraraka asked him, causing him to raise his head and realize what was happening. You look a bit pale, Ida mentioned, frowning. Are you sick? After a brief pause, the boy shook his head. Just overwhelmed, he muttered, pressing his free hand against the top of his nose and rubbing it lightly. Ida put his hand on his chin. A headache? He questioned. Uraraka raised her brows. How do you know? Vincent. Ah, he shook his head. My brother often does the same thing when he's stressed. He taught me that it soothes headaches for a bit. Izuku nodded a late response to Ida's question. That dumbass Quirk lets him see freaky fear cloud things. Bakugo butted in as he walked past their table. He didn't miss how Uraraka frowned at him, but he ignored it and instead continued. The weak-butt nerd gets a headache when there's too many nervous fuckers around, though. Language? Ida scolded, though he also tossed Izuku a look of concern. Bakugo rolled his eyes. Yeah, fries. Anyways, there's that shitty rescue training coming up. All the pansies are freaked about it. The engine-quirked boy looked somewhat peeved by Bakugo's insistence to be rude, but he glanced down, frowning nonetheless. I see. Well, maybe you should go eat in the classroom today, Uraraka offered. I'm sure if you asked Aizawa-sensei. Wait, actually. She paled slightly. I don't know how he'd react. It's still worth a try, Ida defended, though he didn't look too sure himself. Bakugo waved them off. Whatever, losers. Have fun with your dumbass convention. Before either Ida or Uraraka could protest, he headed off, annoyedly heading towards Kirishima's table, with the latter waving at him with a wide grin. Well, Ida finally said, sighing at the blonde's less-than-elegant exit, are you planning on asking Aizawa-sensei to use his room? Izuku shrugged. I guess. Alright, then, Uraraka chirped, smiling brightly. See ya then, Midoriya. Also, she mentioned, eyes flicking towards Bakugo, next time we hang out, you gotta tell us what happened with him. The freckled boy gave a slight nod before waving his hand lightly. Sure. See you. Both offered him a kind goodbye, and with that, Izuku left the lunchroom, with nobody seeming to even notice his exit. It struck him as a bit odd for a second, but he quickly dropped it, figuring that the teachers were too busy to monitor that day. Once Izuku left, he wasted no time in heading to 1A, only to see that his teacher was leaving the room right when he stepped up to the door. Aizawa stopped as soon as he saw the boy, looking a bit annoyed but still putting in a small effort to raise his brow. "Kid, what are you doing here?" "The lunchroom was giving me a headache," he replied bluntly, causing the man to blink. His face twisted, but he simply sighed and nodded. "Whatever. I'm assuming this has to do with your quirk." When Izuku replied with a nod, Aizawa waved him off. "Tell me later. Just make sure to throw your trash somewhere else. I don't want it sitting around in the room." Todoroki also insisted he was allowed to eat in the room, so do with that information as you wish. "Anyways," he grumbled, turning and heading down the hall. "I have a meeting to get to." Izuku blinked, watching as the man headed down the hall before shaking his head and stepping inside. His eyes drifted slowly to the left and, sure enough, Todoroki was sitting silently as he slurped on soba, eyes flickering up to meet Izuku's before narrowing and turning back towards his bowl. After a moment, the freckled boy stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Afterwards, he wasted no time in heading over to his desk, where he slipped into his seat and began to eat in silence. Once about 5 minutes had passed, Izuku heard the sound of a clearing throat. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, only to see Todoroki standing to his side. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, voice somewhat cold. Izuku turned back towards his food, and it seemed that Todoroki was annoyed. However, before he had the chance to voice it, he spoke up. "My quirk lets me see people's fear. Too much is overwhelming. Everyone's worried about the rescue training today, and it gave me a headache." Todoroki paused for a moment and, although his expression barely changed, there was a flicker in the cloud around him, and, if Izuku was looking, he might have seen his fractionally raised eyebrows. "Why are you in here?" Izuku questioned, figuring that it was what he was meant to say. For whatever reason, even though Todoroki had asked the question first, he almost seemed taken aback. However, his expression quickly became stony. "It's none of your business." Izuku didn't even bother turning. "Sorry. I thought you wanted me to ask." Todoroki's eye twitched and his fist clenched, tension clear in his form, and of course, it was made even more noticeable since Izuku sensed a change around the boy. "Something wrong?" the freckled boy asked, though his voice was as monotone as ever. Todoroki paused for a moment, brows knitting together before he finally spoke. "Have your parents ever hurt you?" Izuku, although unable to become surprised, took a pause at the question. Slowly, though, he turned his head towards the boy. "No." "Why?" The heterochromatic boy frowned, and he almost seemed angry in a way. "Then why do you act like that?" "Like what?" he asked, though he was pretty sure he knew what he meant. Todoroki looked frustrated as he attempted to find his words. "Like me," he finally let out, gesturing towards the freckled boy. "Clearly we're the same, at least in some regards." Izuku put his hand on the back of his neck, leaning to the side and looking bored, just like always. "How?" "You." He clenched his fist, obviously becoming annoyed. "You only have one goal you're focused on." The purple fog swirled around him, deepening in color and seeming more like storm clouds than anything. "You push everything else away and dash." "No, I don't," the boy replied simply, picking up some of his rice. Then why?" he questioned with more emotion in his voice than Izuku had ever heard from Todoroki before. "Why are you here alone? Why are you always wearing that blank face? We must be the same. Why are you lying to me?" Izuku paused. "I'm not sure about your reasoning," he finally said, "but mine's because of my quirk." Todoroki's eyes widened before quickly narrowing. "So you are Dash." "I'm not sure what you're trying to suggest here," the freckled boy interrupted, half ignoring the way that the heterochromatic boy twitched, "but I meant it literally. My quirk blocks my emotions. I don't have them anymore." He waved his hand slightly, cutting it through the air. "They're gone. And the only reason I'm here," he continued, barely paying attention to Todoroki's partly angry yet partly confused expression, is because too much fear and nervousness in a room causes me to become overwhelmed. Otherwise I'd be sitting with Uraraka and Ida, probably. Besides, he finished his explanation, popping the last of his food into his mouth, I may not have a dad, but I know that I loved my mom. Todoroki stiffened at the word loved, but was otherwise silent. He had convinced himself that Izuku Midoriya was just like him, hurt by his family and forced to train his quirk until he suppressed everything. He figured that was why he seemed so uncaring while also having a strong quirk, and, sure, it might have been too large of a coincidence, but he most certainly didn't expect the boy's explanation either. Before the heterochromatic boy could respond again, though, a loud alarm began to blare through the halls, catching both boys' attention. While Todoroki remained still, Izuku pushed himself out of his seat, stepping to the door. What are you doing? The other boy asked hesitantly. Clearly that's an alarm, Izuku replied absent-mindedly, walking up to the wall of windows outside and peering through. Todoroki waited for the boy to reply, only to grow impatient, which, admittedly, was out of character for him, and he didn't know exactly why, but this Midoriya really got on his nerves. Well, what's out there? Izuku paused for a moment. It looks like the media's there, he muttered, though his voice was fainter than before. The other boy narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. So? Why do you seem so off? For one, he shifted, nausea settling in his mind, fear just started lifting in waves. And he stiffened, albeit because of the side effects of his quirk rather than any of his own emotions. Everyone should be at lunch. And? Todoroki let out, gesturing towards the boy. But there's several floors below us. And, he said quietly, looking as if he might pass out, it's not just them. Todoroki furrowed his brows. What do you mean? Like you said, all of the classes should be at lunch right now. It's the teachers, he replied bluntly, causing Todoroki's eyes to widen. Finally realizing the gravity of the situation, because, while they can be annoying, all of the pros definitely shouldn't be that afraid of the media, he walked up to the window to stand by Izuku. His eyes immediately fell upon the gate, fingers twitching. The gate's gone, he muttered. Exactly. Todoroki clenched his fists. He knew that nobody at UA would be careless enough to accidentally lift the gates and, from what he remembered from Aizawa-sensei's exit, all of the teachers were supposed to be in a meeting. That means, somehow, the wall was destroyed. He took in a breath. There's no way the media was able to destroy UA's gate. Suddenly, Todoroki's eyes darted to the very back of the crowd. While the camera crew struggled to scramble inside, a man, wearing a large, cloaking hoodie and with the rest of his body covered, and even then too far away to study, stood towards the back, remaining deathly still. Just as Todoroki took in the sight, though, he heard a stressed noise next to him, causing him to immediately glance over. Before the boy could even spit out a single word, he half-stumbled forwards, hands shooting out awkwardly in an effort to catch the shaky, falling boy next to him. He grunted when his weight fell into his arms, and he began lowering both of them to the ground, pressing his hand against Izuku's forehead. A fever. Midoriya, Todoroki said quickly, are you all right? The boy took in a shaky breath, sweat dripping down his paled skin. Too much, he forced out. Todoroki's mind briefly flickered back to what Izuku had said about his quirk, and he bit the inside of his cheek before shaking his head. I'm going to use my quirk on you, all right? Izuku was barely able to move, but Todoroki took the centimeters of head movement as permission. Wasting no further time, the heterochromatic boy placed Izuku carefully on the ground, pressing a fingertip against his forehead. He took in a deep breath and began to channel his quirk slowly and cautiously, careful to retain the right balance of chill. He'd used the trick on his siblings countless times. Whenever they had fevers, he'd cool their body just enough that they weren't too uncomfortable and could be treated or, at the very least, go to sleep peacefully. Luckily, this meant that he wasn't in much danger of freezing the freckled boy, and he knew just how cold he should make his hand. Once Izuku's fever began to dip, Todoroki took in another breath. I'm going to get you to recovery, girl. I can't carry you well and keep tending to your fever, so it might get uncomfortable after a while. He received a small nod in response, and with that, Todoroki lightly lifted his hand before placing both under the boy and picking him up. He believed Fuyumi called it bridal style. Once he had a steady hold on Izuku, who was honestly heavier than he expected, but he supposed that, even though he seemed small, the boy was still a Hero Corps student. Todoroki headed down the hall, immediately relieved that he had the foresight to study Yue's layout. Within only a few minutes, Todoroki was able to make it to Recovery Girl, half out of breath and unable to ignore the fact that the freckled boy was burning up even more than before. It must be because we're closer to everyone. Unable to free either of his hands, the heterochromatic boy resorted to kicking the door lightly with his foot. The time taken for the door to open seemed as if it were taking hours, leaving Todoroki to let out heavy breaths, and considering the fact that he had just half ran through the halls carrying one of his classmates, it was entirely fair. Soon, though, the door clicked open and Recovery Girl revealed herself. Before she could even ask what was wrong, Todoroki pushed past her and placed Izuku on one of the beds before collapsing into a nearby chair. The woman closed the door behind him, frowning. "What seems to be the matter, Sonny? Aren't students meant to be evacuating at the moment?" "It's just the media," Todoroki muttered, even though he was certain that it wasn't entirely true. "But," he said, leaning forwards and catching his breath, "my friend." He hesitated, finding that the words seemed to roll off his tongue strangely. However, he quickly shook his head in order to continue. "That my classmate became overwhelmed because of his quirk." Recovery Girl nodded, and she seemed familiar with the boy. "I understand. It was good of you to carry him here." "He had a fever," Todoroki mentioned. "I was able to cool it for a few minutes, but when we moved closer to the panic, he burned." He frowned at his word choice but continued nonetheless. "He began burning up again." The woman, already listening to his ragged breathing and checking up on him, nodded. "Luckily, he doesn't seem to be too bad, but," she sighed, "I don't believe he mentioned this part of his quirk." Todoroki's lips twitched downwards slightly at her comment. Although he hadn't realized it before, he didn't know too much about Izuku's quirk. And, furthermore, he barely knew anything about any of his classmates' quirks. With his countless hours, months, and years of training, he hadn't seen the need to pay attention in the first place. After the first thought appeared, another realization dawned on him. Izuku could clearly sense fear. That meant that, not only would he be able to spot people from miles away, but he'd be able to see what state they were in. Additionally, although he didn't pay much attention to the class fights, he had caught the tail end of Midoriya and Bakuga's fight, and he remembered stiffening once he saw the towering beast over the absolutely terrified blonde. He supposed it just didn't settle in until now, but as his eyes drifted towards the sick boy, his brows knitted together in an uncomfortable realization. Izuku Midoriya was strong, maybe even stronger than him. "Whatever this was," Snipe said, a sort of unexpected solemnness in his voice, "it wasn't unplanned." "Of course it wasn't," Vlad retorted. "UA's gates don't just crumble when the media shows up. This place is built for optimal security. This is something serious." Nemuri spoke up, eyes sharp as she leaned against her chair. "There's no doubt that there was another party that let them inside." Toshinori frowned. "Villains? Probably looking for the newest member of UA's staff," Shoyuta muttered. The man looked a bit hurt at first, but he didn't speak up, instead offering a somewhat uneasy nod. "Calm down, everyone," Nizu finally spoke up, catching the teacher's attention. Although the man seemed as calm as ever, everyone in the room knew better. His whiskers lightly twitched and his eyes were somehow beadier than normal, and it almost seemed as if there was an aura of emotions radiating off of the principal. Still, he sat in his raised chair, clasping his paws in his lap. "While I find it rather unsettling of the implications of the situation, it'll do no good with UA's staff panicking about the incident." The teachers slumped down in an uneasy acceptance, allowing the man to continue. "That doesn't mean, however," Nizu said with an edge in his voice, "that we shouldn't speak about this. Clearly, someone has decided to attack UA for a reason, and it'd be best to be quick in getting to the bottom of it." Cementos frowned. "Well, the only thing I could imagine anyone doing this was as a distraction." Exactly, Nemuri nodded, shoulders tense. They must have wanted something and used the media as a cover-up. Or, Shoyuta spoke up, catching the other's attention. It was a warning. The teachers immediately stiffened, exchanging nervous glances. Shoyuta could understand why. The implications of that type of warning could be disastrous. It meant that they were proving their power, letting everyone know that they could attack if they wanted. That at some point they would. Nizu agreed with a slightly strained smile. What Aizawa said is also entirely possible. In fact, it might even be a mixture of the two things. At the very least, though, he said, shrugging away his tension, even if they did get inside, it wasn't very far. As soon as the security breach was found, I checked every camera in the school and nobody was inside. Power Loader still looked uneasy, much like the others. There could be a number of reasons for that, though. He paused for a moment before continuing. What if they had an invisibility, speed, or teleportation quirk? Another similar quirk that allowed them to be ignored by the cameras? Or, he finally offered, there's at least a dozen support items that I could think of off the top of my head that could get them where they needed to be without being noticed. Yes, the principal nodded, whiskers twitching. Although it's unsettling to admit, each of those ideas is entirely possible. Admittedly, there are others as well. For example, during the breach, the computers, although they're nearly impossible to hack into without an intelligence quirk, could have been compromised, whether it by a technopathic quirk or something else. Ectoplasm sighed. That's not exactly reassuring. And it's not meant to be, Nizu replied bluntly. We need to have the understanding that this was likely a coordinated attack, whether it be about making a statement, stealing information, both, or something entirely different. With this information at hand, he said with a firm tone, we need to prepare and make sure our students are ready for any possibilities. Shoyuta opened his mouth to speak, only for a buzzing to emanate from his pocket. With a half-confused expression, he pulled out his phone, only to see that Recovery Girl was ringing him. Recovery Girl, he muttered in explanation, putting the phone to his ear. Hello. Eraserhead, the woman said quickly, one of your students is here. The man immediately stiffened, standing up in his chair and alerting the other teachers. What happened? Nemuri looked at him, concerned. Shoyuta ignored her, instead holding his breath as he waited for Recovery Girl to continue. Now, she replied, you don't need to get too worked up now. He's only fallen a bit ill with a fever. Though, she muttered, his heart rate is a bit high and well. What? Shoyuta snapped, using a harsher tone than intended but ultimately uncaring in the moment. Aizawa, she scolded, I told you it wasn't all that bad. It's that one boy, Izuku Midoriya. Shuta's brows furrowed. What exactly happened? I'm not entirely sure since it's not in his medical records, she huffed. But another boy, Shudo Todoroki, carried him here and said he became overwhelmed because of his quirk. The man resisted the urge to rub his temples, shoulders relaxing slightly. Why was he using his quirk? He wasn't, she responded. It's apparently a side effect. As I was saying before, he's got a decent-sized fever at the moment, but he'll ultimately be fine. Still, she said sternly, we need to ensure that this doesn't happen again. We're lucky that Todoroki helped the boy when he did. If he didn't, Midoriya might have been out of commission for a day or so. Shuta's stomach churned. Is he awake? Recovery Girl paused for a moment before replying. Not yet, but he should wake up soon. That I'm heading over, he muttered. Tell me anything else you can when I get there. Before the woman could respond, Shoyuta clicked his phone off and took a deep breath. I need to go, he said absent-mindedly, heading quickly towards the door. That problem child's in Recovery Girl's office. Toshinori's eyes widened. Is the kid all right? Apparently he's fine, Shoyuta said quickly, something about a side effect of his quirk. Wasting no further time, he opened the door. Let me know if you figure anything out. Nizu gave a quick nod, though the man didn't turn around to see it. Instead, he closed the door behind him before heading down the hall. If anyone claimed he ran, though, he'd insist they were lying. Shoyuta had to stop himself from throwing the door open, but he was unable to keep from opening it as quickly as possible and taking deep breaths as he stepped inside. Upon noticing Todoroki staring at him, though, he straightened himself and cleared his throat, masking his concern. "What happened?" he asked gruffly, though there was a remaining tinge of worry in his voice. Recovery Girl sighed. "I told you not to panic," she muttered before heading over to close the door. "As I said before, Midoriya is mostly fine except for his fever. It's been going down since a good 10 minutes ago, though." Shoyuta furrowed his brows. "What about you mentioning him possibly being out of commission?" The woman frowned, heading back to her seat. "Admittedly, that is something to worry about. If this is a recurring problem for the boy, we'll need to make sure that it's placed on his medical record and he has resources and medication to get through it." Shoyuta found his eyes falling upon the sleeping boy, a sigh escaping his lips. "All right, then," he said, allowing his shoulders to relax as he fell into a chair. "What happened?" Recovery Girl gestured towards Todoroki. "You'd be better off asking the boy. I'll be stepping out to call his mother and let Nizu know what's happening. And," she mentioned right before leaving, "his medication won't be ready until at least a week from now. Make sure nothing too stressful happens until then." "All right," the man muttered in reply, turning towards Todoroki once she left the room. He leaned forwards, brows furrowed. "So?" Todoroki's eyes widened by a fraction, but they were quick to return to normal. "Midoriya and I were talking," he said vaguely, concerning but ultimately unimportant until he could handle it later. Shoyuta figured, and then the alarms went off. He went over to the windows to see what was happening, and he began to look sick. "Do you know why?" Shoyuta asked carefully, noticing how the boy's lips were slightly curled downwards. He explained that his quirk allows him to see fear. He glanced up at Shoyuta, and the man nodded, already having known about that aspect. "When there's too much, he gets overwhelmed and becomes sick. I don't know everything about it," he admitted, and he collapsed soon after the panic began. Shoyuta slightly frowned, internally sighing. The kid definitely didn't mention that part of his quirk. "I was able to cool him with my right side," Todoroki continued, "but since I had to take him to Recovery Girl, I couldn't continue. When we neared the stairs, his fever worsened. Likely because everyone was nearby," Shoyuta muttered, running his hand through his hair. "Anything else?" Todoroki visibly stiffened, which was concerning for the normally stoic boy. "That it's not about Midoriya," he replied cautiously after a moment, studying the man's reaction. Shoyuta narrowed his eyes, not liking where the conversation was heading. "What is it?" The boy paused, brows knitting together. "Before Midoriya fell, I saw someone out the window. They were behind the rest of the media just standing there." Stomach churning, Shoyuta leaned back into his chair. "That's it?" Todoroki nodded slowly. "He was wearing clothes that covered him entirely, so I couldn't see what he looked like. But..." Shoyuta sighed, watching the boy's hand curl into a fist. "You think that he was behind this?" The boy looked down uneasily, which was more than enough confirmation for him. "All right," he said, trying to keep the situation calm, "I'll let Nizu know. For now, don't worry about it, but also don't mention this to anyone else." He knew that Todoroki didn't exactly have anyone he'd want to talk to, which was definitely something he'd like to talk about later, but he figured it was safer to mention it anyways. "Otherwise, are you all right?" Todoroki looked somewhat surprised, only for his gaze to become more calculating. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Kid, you were just put through a stressful situation," Shoyuta sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I'd be surprised if you were totally fine." "I am," Todoroki replied far too quickly, voice returning to its normal, cold state. Shoyuta considered pressing the issue, but inevitably decided that, upon seeing the way Todoroki put his guard back up, it was better to drop it for the time being. However, he would be looking into it later, whether the boy protested or not. His lips curled downwards after a moment, though, a thought striking him. Briefly, he figured it'd be best to request that Hound Dog speak to him. However, once he remembered that his father was Endeavor of all people, he was forced to reconsider. That man, although he was responsible for the largest amounts of arrests in the city, and of those nearby, was known for being a hothead even when disregarding his quirk. And every time Shoyuta was forced to interact with him, he was nothing but harsh and seemingly ignorant of anything and anyone, and was instead solely focused on capturing the villains. Endeavor's attitude was exactly why, even though he had even more arrests than All Might, he was still the number 2 hero. Not only was he nothing but awful to his fans, Shoyuta could admit that he found them annoying, but the man went past being simply rude with how he treated them, but he had numerous counts of property damage under his belt. And because he only focused on the villains, he hardly ever saved citizens and even injured many who happened to be in his line of fire. In short, the man was prideful and nothing short of a terrible human being, or, as Shoyuta sometimes thought, a fiery dumpster with the single emotion of rage. He carried himself in such a way that didn't allow for much criticism, as he'd quickly shoot down everyone who attempted to call him out or ask him too many personal questions. Endeavor pushed himself to the very brink of his patience and health while trying to surpass All Might, that much was clear. And, unfortunately, Shoyuta could only figure that he was the same way about his family. If it were found out that his son was going to therapy for anything, no matter how much good it'd do for the boy, Endeavor would be the type of father to be offended and outright refuse that there was anything wrong in the first place. As his eyes drifted towards the heterochromatic boy, he couldn't help but clench his fist, only able to hope that the kid wasn't being treated too harshly. He didn't have much time to think about it though, as, just as he was finished pondering about Endeavor, Recovery Girl re-entered the room. "His mother should be here in around 15 minutes or so," she said, glancing over at Todoroki and Shoyuta. "You should probably return to your class, Eraser. And Sunny, you're fine, so you can head along as well. It'd be best to allow Midoriya to rest for a while before his mother shows." Todoroki stood and nodded. "Thank you," he said, having already returned to his monotone voice, before heading to the door. He stole a barely noticeable glance back at Izuku's bed before quickly turning around and leaving the room all within a few moments. Shoyuta sighed once the boy left, muttering under his breath as he pushed himself off his chair. "Eraser," Recovery Girl spoke up after a moment, still looking towards the door, "keep an eye on that boy. I only did the bare minimum when it came to a checkup, but it was hard not to notice the old scars. Not to mention the fact that he shot down any questions about himself." The man slightly frowned, though internally he couldn't help but worry that his assumption about Endeavor was right. Though, instead of mentioning anything just yet, he simply nodded. "Alright, please let me know if you notice anything else. I'll talk to Nizu." Recovery Girl sighed, waving the man off and turning around. "Of course. Now get to your class, Eraser. Don't keep your students waiting." Shoyuta nodded once again, eyes flicking towards Izuku's bed before he left the room. As he stepped into the hall, he sighed, staring up at the ceiling. "DMN problem children." Inko burst into the room, breathing heavily as her eyes darted around. Recovery Girl startled slightly, but offered a knowing nod after a moment, gesturing towards Izuku's bed. The green-haired woman hastily bowed before rushing to her son's bed, seeing that he was leaning against the bed frame. "Izu," she let out, tears running down her cheeks. "I heard what happened, sweetie." "I'm all right, Mom," he said, not bothering to fake a smile. After all, she knew him better than anyone. "I just got overwhelmed." "Oh, sweetie," she muttered, ruffling his curls. "I know, but I can't help but worry." She took in a deep breath. "You're my only son, and I don't know what I'd do if—" Inko trailed off, a sort of distraught look clear in her teary eyes, and Izuku lightly placed his hand on hers. Once he caught her attention, he nodded. "I know, Ma. I promise I'll always come back home." The woman stiffened at the last words, but she frantically nodded nonetheless. I know. "Love you, Mom," he said, putting in the effort to make his tone softer. Inko paused to SCK in a shaky breath, only to lean forwards and wrap her son in a loving hug. "I love you too, Izu," she said in a tearful voice, fingers trembling as she ran them through the boy's hair. "That I love you too." Walking past Recovery Girl's office, the boy paused, eye-catching on a familiar head of green curls through the door's window. Backtracking, he stepped up to the door and glanced through, eyes widening as they fell upon Izuku. After a moment, he let out a light chuckle, a fond smile playing on his lips. I knew you'd make it. Aizu. All right, Shoyuta said, scanning the room after catching his student's attention. We'll be heading to the bus in about 15 minutes. Any questions before we leave? Ida was quick to raise his hand, and the black-haired man suppressed a sigh before gesturing towards the boy. Yes, Ida? Sir, he called out, keeping his arm perfectly straight in the air. You told us we'd be doing rescue training but offered no further elaboration. What exactly are we doing? Shoyuta put his hand on the back of his neck, leaning slightly. It'll be better to see the location for yourself. All I'll say is that each of you is expected to visit at least half of the sections, and it's preferable, and by that I mean I strongly advise, that you don't keep yourself in your comfort zones. Ida frowned. Isn't it illogical to keep further information from us? After all, you'll have to do more explaining there if this is the case. Don't use the word illogical against me, Shoyuta replied, causing the boy to startle with his glare. A moment later, though, the man relaxed, dropping his hand to the side. This will be an exercise to test your abilities to adapt. You'll be provided as much information as you need, nothing more, nothing less. The blue-haired boy looked uneasy, but nodded nonetheless. All right. Thank you, Aizawa-sensei. He stood up to give a bow before falling back in his seat. Shoyuta raised a brow at the boy's need to be extra, wondering how the hell someone as relaxed as Tensei. Push the shopping cart from your mind. It never happened, and no, I'm not in denial, could ever be related to someone like Tenya Ida. Before he could ponder the thought more, Kaminari caught his attention. Ah yeah, the boy let out, waving his hand slightly. How long is the trip? An hour's drive on the bus, Shoyuta replied. Do we get to wear our costumes? Bakugu called out, not even bothering to raise a hand. Shudazai twitched at the blonde's rudeness, but sighed. Yes, you will be wearing your costumes. Jairu raised her hand next, and the man nodded for her to ask her question. Are we allowed to bring music and stuff like that? I don't care what you bring, just know that you're responsible for it. After seeing Kaminari and Siro's exchange of glances, however, he changed his mind. Scratch that, only bring reasonable items. I just wanted a flamethrower, Kaminari muttered, and Shoyuta didn't even want to ask where he was planning on getting one. Can you at least tell us the place we're going? Mina asked, phone at the ready and a gleam in her eye. No, the man replied bluntly, causing her to pout. After a bout of silence, Shoyuta looked over the room, only to see Izuku waiting patiently with his hand in the air. The man briefly wondered how long he had been sitting there, but he quickly shrugged the thought off and nodded. Yes, Midoriya? Izuku's hand slowly lowered and he spoke up. What if our costumes are damaged? Shuda's mind quickly supplied him his and All Might's conversation about Midoriya and Bakugu's fight, one that he'd likely talk to the two about later, and he sighed. Only your pants are damaged, correct? The boy replied with a simple nod. All right, just wear your gym pants with the rest of your costume until they get fixed. Once the boy nodded, Shoyuta turned to face the rest of the class. Is that all? When he received no response, the man leaned back, gesturing towards the now opening costume drawers. If you're all done, get your costumes on and head outside. Go through the closest exit and you'll be able to see the bus. Yes, Sensei, the class responded in unison. Once the man waved them off, they all stood and began grabbing their costumes, chatting as they followed him out the door. As Shoyuta walked towards the exit, hands in his pockets, he glanced out the window and towards the new gate with an uncomfortable feeling nagging at his mind. After a moment, though, he shook his head and let the thought drop. He was just paranoid. Everything would be fine. He trusted his gut. Something would definitely go wrong. All he could do, though, was hope that he was sorely mistaken or, at the very least, nothing would go too poorly. And if things didn't end well, he'd send anyone who even dared to look at his brat straight to hell. Izuku remained silent as Ida ushered everyone into the bus, simply staring into the distance even as the boy's mood fell when he realized his layout wouldn't work. There was something nagging at the back of his mind. He wasn't quite sure what it was, but, no matter how hard he tried to push the feeling away, it stubbornly remained. He first started feeling it when he collapsed just a few days prior. Speaking of, would that medicine actually help him when he finally received it? It crept up on him as soon as he caught sight of Yue's destroyed gate and only worsened when he spotted a hooded figure in his back. After that, things became blurrier. He vaguely remembered Todoroki asking a few questions before carrying him down the hall, but he was certain he passed out before they even arrived at Recovery Girl's office. Izuku, admittedly, wasn't asleep the entire time. He almost spoke up. But when Todoroki and his homeroom teacher began to talk about that hooded man, he paused and strained his ears to listen. From what he was able to catch, he knew that there was something bad going on, something that even the teachers weren't sure about it. Both Todoroki's and Aizawa's fear radiated off of them, even if dampened, and forced a shiver down Izuku's spine. That's when the feeling returned, and somehow, he felt as if they weren't just his own thoughts. For a brief moment, he wondered if, because he was in such close proximity to the two worried heroes, or rather a hero and a hero in training, he was also experiencing their worries. He pushed that thought aside just as quickly as it came. After all, it was impossible to even consider that he could feel even a twinge of fear. Still, though, it was unnerving. God damn Deku, a voice roared, and Izuku's thoughts disappeared in an instant. He slowly raised his head, only to see that Bakugo had sprung from his seat, and his knuckles were white from gripping the seat in front of him. Shut the hell up. Izuku ped his head to the side, glancing around to see nervous faces all staring at the enraged boy. Don't act like you don't know, he barked. You're muttering up a goddamn storm again. I'm sick of it. The boy simply blinked. Sorry, Kaken. Is he mad at me again? You don't sound like it. Ida opened his mouth to speak. Well, that's Dash. Shut it, Four Eyes. If you say another goddamn word about shitty Deku and him being some emotionless wreck, I swear to God that I'll RIP your engines straight out of your goddamn calves, he roared, causing the students in the bus to pale. The boy blinked before adjusting his glasses and frowning. That's not a very heroic way to talk. And, he added, you should really refrain from cursing so much. It's impolite. Do I look like I give a flying F dash? Bakugo, a voice said sharply, catching the blonde's attention. The FU dash. As soon as he turned towards the source of the sound, he closed his mouth, seeing that Aizawa was glaring at him with glowing, crimson eyes as his hair tangled within the air. Ida's right. A future hero shouldn't be talking like that and, he added, seeing the twitch of Bakugo's eye, next time you want someone to be quiet, just ask. Bakugo growled and looked as if he might burst, but he huffed and muttered yes, sensei, under his breath before falling into his seat. Midoriya, you were muttering. Try to keep your thoughts inside your head, alright, problem child. Aizawa said in a drab voice, turning around before the boy could even nod. Uraraka turned towards the blonde once their teacher fell back into his chair for his nap, narrowing her eyes. Why are you being such a bully to Aizu? Aizu? The boy in question voiced, though it looked as if she didn't hear him. Somehow, he didn't notice the light blush that spread across her cheeks after her slip-up. The F you say, round cheeks? He barked, looking as if he was ready to fight, again. Kaminari shrugged. Yeah, we've only known each other for like, a week. So it's really telling that we know you have the personality of hot, flaming garbage. Todoroki barely opened his eyes, but Izuku could have sworn he muttered something along the lines of, sounds familiar, before allowing his eyelids to fall closed once again. Bakugo growled, firecrackers popping in his palms. Eh? What did you say, discount Pikachu? Wanna die? That's still not hero-like, Ida objected. That's IT. Bakugo barked, I'm gonna kill all of you motherfuckers. Todoroki looked offended. I have done no such thing. The blonde suddenly stilled, turning towards the heterochromatic boy as if he had just watched him eat a crayon. Todoroki narrowed his eyes. I told you. I've fed no mothers. What? Every trace of annoyance had removed itself from Bakugo's voice, and he was simply searching the boy as if doing so would provide him any answers. After a moment, though, the anger returned. Are you mocking me? I'm stating a fact, he replied simply, and before Bakugo could yell again, Kaminari burst into laughter. Jesus Christ, I thought he was joking, he wheezed. Mina snorted too, barely making the effort to cover her laughter. Me too. I think you've misunderstood, Todoroki-kun, Yayarosa said, though she looked as if she was holding back laughter as well. The heterochromatic boy raised a brow in confusion and, while the majority of the bus continued laughing like madmen, Bakugo seethed next to the boy, yelling about how icy hot could be that fucking dense. While Izuku didn't laugh, he could understand why the others were. Although he was pretty socially inept, he wasn't as bad as Todoroki and, at the very least, could tell that Bakugo's insult wasn't meant to be taken literally. Not that he hadn't had his fair share of similar incidents. Before Izuku could reminisce, though, Aizawa cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back towards him and causing the laughter to die out. We're here. Everyone get out. Yes, sensei. Hey man, a voice said from behind Katsuki, causing the blonde to turn around and connect eyes with. What was his name again? What do you want? He stared at the boy, squinting as if doing so would help him figure it out. After a few moments, he just said the first thing that came to mind when he saw the dumbass. Shitty hair. He called him that before, right? Yeah. He'd just keep doing that. The boy blinked, only for a smile to creep up on his face. You know, it'd be better if you just called me Kirishima. Ah, that's the one. I don't bother with extras' names, Katsuki replied, rolling his eyes and turning around. Now if you don't mind, I'll be Dash. Hey, don't be so quick to leave, Bakubro, the redhead exclaimed cheerfully, speeding up to walk beside the boy. Katsuki's eye twitched. What did you just call me? Sorry man, Kirishima simply shrugged, a nickname for a nickname. Anyways, he said before the blonde could rip his throat out, how come you're being so harsh on Midobro? I thought you were friends now? He squinted, trying to remember. Before? The blonde stared at him for a moment before turning. Is the only FNG word you know, bro? Hey, he blurted out, don't avoid the question, B dash. Man and bro, then, he replied sarcastically. Kirishima very maturely crossed his arms and pouted. No need to call me out like that, Bakubro. Katsuki rolled his eyes. Maybe I'll think about leaving you alone when you stop calling me that shitty nickname. Actually, he scoffed, glancing towards the boy with a sharp gaze, why are you even talking to me in the first place? You want something? 'Cause I'm not helping. What? Kirishima asked, genuinely confused. Course not. I just thought you could use a friend. The blonde's heart stuttered, and he felt defensive rage bubble in his stomach. Excuse me? Oh no. Kirishima shook his head frantically, eyes wide. It's not like that, I swear, man. I mean, you're just over here by yourself and Dash. Katsuki scoffed, speeding up and shoving his hands into his pockets. I don't need any FING one. You're all just extras. Stepping stones on my goddamn path. Bakubro. The blonde refused to accept that the pang he felt was guilt, and instead decided that it had to be anger. I never asked for anyone to talk to me. And if you must effing know, he all but growled out, Deku and I aren't friends. I may not hate him, but he's nothing more than a goddamn rival to me. What? I thought you were saying something about dreams and Dash. Shut up, shitty hair. Katsuki barked, turning around and practically spitting on the redhead. That's not my goddamn name. And I don't have to tell you any thing about myself, got that? It'd be best if you stayed the F away. The last sentence was unheard by everyone except him. Before I mess everything up again. All right, Kirishima said, seeming dejected. Katsuki simply scoffed. Sorry man. I'll go. You better, Katsuki muttered in reply, not even bothering to watch as the redhead joined his other dumbass friends. Katsuki gritted his teeth. He hated to admit it, but he did feel bad when he sent the redhead off after blowing up on him. As much as he'd like to refute their claims, those shitty extras were right. He was being unnecessarily rude to Deku, and he FNG knew that. He knew he was an a-hole. And he was okay with that. No, he was used to that. He tried. He really did try to go around Deku. Like a few days prior when he talked with Deku's dumbass friends as if he were one of them. As if their relationship was normal. But every time he'd so much as glance at the boy, his gut twisted and he could only remember those distorted screeches that seemed to pester him whenever it was too quiet. So, he decided to push Deku away. Push everyone away. All he had to do was focus on becoming a hero. He didn't need friends. If they wanted to try to beat him at being number one, they could go the F ahead for all he cared, though he was sure that nobody but Deku and maybe Todoroki could even match him. But he wouldn't accept friendship. HEDJUSTRUINITNYWAY. He wasn't like them. He wasn't about how to preach about how friendship is magic, and it was the key to everything in the goddamn universe. He didn't need them. He was okay being alone. He didn't need anyone. Izuku stood in the crowd of his classmates, eyes flicking around as they waited for the teacher's explanation. Now that they had arrived at the USJ, the boy's feeling was even worse, refusing to leave the front of his mind. It was no longer a nagging feeling. No, it was more like a threat that something would go wrong. Then, glancing up, the boy noticed 13 holding up 3 fingers, while Aizawa simply sighed. Afterwards, he almost immediately realized that All Might, who he distinctly remembered was supposed to be there, was nowhere to be seen. He wondered if there was a connection. Before he could give the idea much thought, though, the two pros ended their conversation and turned towards the class. Aizawa stood in a lazy position, though Izuku couldn't help but notice his eyes seemed to be more alert than usual, and 13 gave a wave to the students. "Oh my god," Uraraka whispered, smiling brightly. 13's like, my favorite hero. She is quite a remarkable pro, Ida mentioned before turning quickly towards their teachers when the space hero began to speak. Her quirk's very versatile, Izuku said absent-mindedly, attempting to keep his thoughts from wandering. Disintegration of matter, even at the atomic level, would seem like a villain's quirk, but she's living proof that quirks don't label the person. It'd be incredibly easy for her to kill living beings, cause irreparable collateral damage, or do any number of things that could bring harm, but instead she uses her quirk to help in rescue efforts and prevent enemy escape. Izuku paused after a moment, ignoring Ida's scolding and handchops that ushered him to stop. He caught the tail end of something about Universal Studios Japan, before reminding himself of the weaknesses. But she has to be incredibly careful to ensure that she doesn't cause critical harm or damage, and the use of her quirk in all efforts leaves her lacking in most physical capabilities. "Whoa, Midoriya," Uraraka said, blinking surprisedly, "you sure know a lot." Before Izuku could reply with more than a spared glance, he was interrupted by another voice. "Back to Midoriya?" "Midoriya, Uraraka," Ida whispered harshly, finally catching his attention, "this isn't the time. You're being very disrespectful and dash." "What's the commotion about?" Aizawa asked tiredly, sighing once his eyes fell upon the boy who seemed to always cause the most trouble. "Ah," Ida replied, straightening, "we apologize, Aizawa-sensei." Uraraka was excited about seeing her favorite hero and, well, Midoriya used his analyzation skills to dash. "You know what?" The man waved him off. "I don't really care. Save it for later." "Got it, problem children?" Ida quickly nodded, looking a bit disappointed in himself but otherwise determined. What for, Izuku wasn't quite sure. "Yes, Aizawa-sensei. I apologize to both you and 13-sensei." Uraraka laughed nervously, blushing. "Sorry, Aizawa-sensei. And She glanced towards 13. "Sorry, 13 ma'am." Although 13 couldn't show her smile, it was audible in her voice. "Thank you. I'm glad to have a fan." While Uraraka fought off her embarrassed, yet happy, blush, Izuku simply shrugged. "Sorry. Midoriya." Ida scolded. "They deserve more than that." "It's fine, Aizawa sighed. "Don't worry about it." "Really?" 13 agreed. "It's no problem. Just make sure to pay attention otherwise, okay?" The three began nodding when, suddenly, Izuku froze. "Midoriya?" Uraraka asked, concerned. "Are you okay?" Aizawa raised a brow, though he had a new stiffness in his stance. "Problem child?" "People are here," he said quietly before raising his voice. People are coming here. A lot of them. He pressed his hand against his head, at least probably more. The man's eyes widened by a fraction, and he quickly spun around, wasting no time in activating his quirk. As soon as he did so, purplish-black smoke began to grow into the shape of a portal, and a crowd of people began pushing their way out. Just like Izuku, who was now being supported by a worried Ida and Uraraka, had said, at least 70 villains had entered the main area. That is this part of the exercise? Kaminari asked hesitantly. Bakugo narrowed his eyes. Clearly not, dipshit. Aizawa grabbed his capture weapon in his hand, goggles already placed fittingly over his narrowed eyes. Everyone, stay back. Bakugo's right. This is real. So, Todoroki said, voice still mostly monotone but holding a new edge to it. They're villains. Izuku took in a deep, sharp breath, mind becoming clouded as the purple smoke grew within the crowd. Bakugo glanced over, scoffing. Calm down, you Affinji extras. How can we be calm? Mineta yelled back, body trembling. The blonde twitched. I don't know, you fucking grape. But if you don't calm the F down, that nerd, he barked, jutting his pointed finger towards Izuku, I's gonna pass the F out and be nothing but dead weight. If you wanna be a goddamn hero, you better learn how the F to deal with it. Mineta looked as if he wanted to fire back, but was clearly too afraid to and remained silent. Izuku's gaze drifted towards Bakugo, noticing that, although he had spoken out about not being scared, his hands were shaking, only being reined in by the clenching of his fists. And, slowly, although the fear still remained, everyone took in deep breaths, making an active effort to keep themselves calmer. It was impressive for a group of first years, but not entirely unexpected of those who wanted to be heroes. All right, Uraraka nodded, a determined look pushing through the fear in her eyes. We've got to keep calm. Not only for Midoriya, Ida agreed, but to make sure this situation is handled correctly. Izuku watched as his classmates continued to push back their fear, though he knew it would be difficult, as was expected from a literal villain attack, before being distracted by Aizawa. Before anyone could say anything else, the man stepped forwards, clearly ready to leap into the crossfire. Wait! Kirishima called out worriedly. Aizawa-sensei, I thought you didn't do well with groups. You can't be a hero if you're a one-trick pony, he replied before leaping downwards and immediately finding himself in a battle. If Izuku didn't feel as if he might puke, he might take the time to watch as the man took each villain down, an interesting and impressive feat, considering his fighting style, but he did feel that way, so instead he did as much as he could to simply stand straight. Slowly, Todoroki inched towards the boy, lightly brushing his arm against him. When Izuku looked over for an explanation, the boy didn't even spare him a glance and, before he could speak up, the freckled boy felt his skin begin to chill. Izuku almost immediately recognized that the boy was attempting to keep the growing fever and headache at bay, and he nodded towards him before turning back towards the rest of his classmates. So, Yaoyorozu said uneasily, what do we do now? Do what you've been doing, 13 said. Don't panic. Keep yourselves calm. Rash decisions and fear will only harm yourselves in this situation. Everyone turned to pay attention to her as she continued. It'll be difficult, I know. After all, you're only first years and haven't even had training anywhere close to this level. But go by your school's motto, kids. The students exchanged glances, silently saying the plus ultra phrase before. Suddenly, the same smoke that had created the portal began to appear before them. Another portal? Uraraka asked uneasily, stepping back. Before anyone could even attempt to answer or ask another question, a figure appeared before them, seeming to be a sort of smoke-covered body with glowing, gold eyes. Hello, students of UA, a smooth voice said, almost seeming to echo, I am Kurogyri of the League of Villains. May I ask where All Might be? Izuku didn't know why, but he almost felt sick as the figure spoke. It looked like a man. It seemed to be coherent. He knew it wasn't just because he seemed to want all might for one reason or another. But around him was the oddest fear cloud he'd ever seen. It seemed to be the mixture of more than one and, rather than having a purplish color, it was a light, wispy blue. What do you want with him, you dumb sheet? Bakuga barked, launching himself forwards. Similarly, Kirishima followed behind, both sporting determined grins. Wait done dash. Before 13 could finish, both leapt into the air, aiming an attack towards the figure. A smoke screen grew from Bakuga's explosions, causing both students, as well as the villain, to seemingly disappear. Everyone watched with bated breaths. God. Izuku's head felt as if it might explode, just waiting for the smoke to disappear, and finally, both boys landing back on their feet, grinning. Their smiles were quickly wiped off their faces, though when the smoke screen fully disappeared and, still standing, floating really, there, was Kurogyri. Nice try, heroes. But you're far from what we came here for. You're nothing more than a nuisance. Before 13 could even begin to tell anyone about the incoming attack, Kurogyri's smoke spread out and, without warning, launched forwards and, group by group, people began to disappear. Uraraka gasped when she noticed that Izuku was being forced through a portal, only for Todoroki to grab him at the last second, both slipping into the same area. The boy gritted his teeth as his back hit the ground, and he immediately knew they were now in a different place, Todoroki kneeling beside him. Midoriya, he simply said. Izuku raised his head, turning towards the boy and silently asking for an explanation. I figured you'd still feel sick, the heterochromatic boy finally responded. It'd be best if you were still in commission, and I'm the only one who can help you. The freckled boy paused for a moment, thinking it over before giving a quick nod. It would be for the best, and it wasn't like he could change what happened in the first place. Izuku began sitting up when, without warning, Todoroki grabbed onto him, pulling him to his feet. The green-haired boy looked up, only to see him looking around with a calculating gaze. Upon feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand from the overwhelming amount of presences, Izuku suddenly found himself wondering how he hadn't noticed the sheer number of people that began to enclose on them when they first arrived. Villains, Todoroki said coldly. Izuku blinked before turning to the side and spotting a pair of floating gloves and a wisp of purple smoke above. Hagakure too. Todoroki turned slightly, seeming almost surprised to see the girl, while she began to step over to them. You guys ended up here too? She whispered nervously. Izuku nodded before turning to look up. Slowly and almost teasingly, villains began to rise from over the rocky area and smirk at the hero students. Well, one with some sort of werewolf-like Quirk grinned. Looks like we got a couple of hero kids to kill. Before he could speak again, ice crept from Todoroki's boot before speeding up and encasing every single villain in the vicinity. The heterochromatic boy then stepped forwards, letting out a frosty breath. Izuku blinked at the boy, noticing that, while nearly everything was covered in ice, Todoroki was careful to keep the area where Hagakure and Izuku stood untouched. Each villain looked incredibly surprised, some even frozen in midair as they attempted to let themselves free. Some demanded to be let go, a ridiculous request, really, while others simply shivered with chattering teeth. It was over before it even began. Katsuki choked on the smoky air before forcing himself to his feet. He muttered, a guilty pang shooting through his chest. Bakubro, Kirishima said, causing him to freeze. He knew someone was there beforehand, but he hadn't bothered turning around. He knew they didn't mean him any harm, that they were no doubt one of his classmates. But it just had to be shitty hair. The one goddamn person who was trying the hardest to become Katsuki's friend no matter how much he pushed him away. And the one person who leapt with the blonde when it came to attempting to face the villain. That meant he was strong, and he didn't want to admit that. It shredded that sliver of hope that Katsuki held about the redhead ever leaving him alone. He was just that kind of goddamn guy. Shitty hair, he finally muttered. The boy seemed to brighten slightly when he said his name, and it only made Katsuki feel worse. Before he could say anything else, Katsuki scoffed and spun around, knocking some villain wannabe straight on his butt. Kirishima blinked surprisedly, looking around. How did you even know he was there? I'm not a dumb shitty hair, he replied with an eye roll before grabbing the villain by his collar and glaring into his eyes. You better tell me what the F you're doing here before I blast your goddamn face off. The fucker then had the nerve to spit in his face and shove himself away from the boy. You think you're so tough because you caught me off guard, little hero? He mocked, which was ironic since the man was, at most, an inch taller than Katsuki. Katsuki's eye twitched, and he lit an explosion in his hand while using the other to wipe the spit off his face. I know you didn't just effing do that. Your potty mouth isn't gonna save you, brat, the alien-looking man smirked before seeming to split into two. You see, you're just dash. I don't care for monologuing, a-hole, Katsuki replied, spitting in both men's faces and, using their surprise against them, he launched forwards and knocked their heads together, adding in a few explosions for good measure. Both fell to the ground with the clone seeming to flicker out. The man snarled on the ground, attempting to push himself up. F brat, he barked, attempting to push himself up but barely able to even focus his eyes and keep his voice from slurring. Katsuki figured the man had a concussion from his attack and grinned. If this dumbass isn't coherent enough to tell me anything, I guess I'm free to blast his butt back to whatever fucking planet he came from. Charging forwards, the blonde dodged the man's attack, which wasn't difficult because of his shitty coordination as a result from his injury, before slipping his hand under his arm and throwing him to the ground. He wondered if it was a crack he heard when, upon seeing the man's wrist bent oddly, and hearing the scream that came next, the blonde confirmed his suspicion. He placed his boot on the man's wrist, grinning and bending down as he winced. Now, fucker. You better spill your plans before I kill your butt. Go to hell, the man spat, barely even awake. Suit yourself, Katsuki growled, a scowl replacing his initial grin as he stamped his boot into the man's wrist. He ignored the muffled cries of pain before landing a brutal, explosion-fueled punch to the man's skull and knocking him out. The man would live probably. Once he ensured that the man wouldn't be waking up anytime soon, Katsuki straightened and scoffed. Useless fucker. Whoa, Kirishima whispered breathlessly and, although the blonde would never admit it, he startled when he saw the starstruck expression in the redhead's eyes. What? He asked, being far too defensive. The redhead grinned, clapping his hand on Katsuki's shoulder. That was so manly, dude, he laughed, giving a thumbs up with his other hand. Katsuki stared at him for a moment before rolling his eyes and shrugging off his hand. Yeah, whatever, shitty hair. Come on, bucko bro, the boy said teasingly. You dash. The blonde suddenly turned around, fist seemingly aimed for Kirishima's face as he roared. Get back, fucker. WH, the redhead yelped, eyes wide. It was just a dash, he blinked, watching as Katsuki suddenly changed trajectory, ripping a rising, shadowy figure from the ground and throwing him back down. Joke. Wasting no time, the blonde was quick to ensure that the person was knocked out before scoffing at Kirishima. Pay attention next time, dumbass. Unless you're looking to die. Kirishima blinked dumbly before a grin spread across his face. Course not. Bet I could even take out more villains than you. Katsuki rolled his eyes for what seemed like the 100th time that day. In your FNG dreams. He turned before Kirishima could even think to call his small smirk a smile. Now let's go, shitty hair. Right? He grinned. After a moment, he added teasingly, you know, I don't think I've ever seen you this calm. The blonde spun around, slamming his fist against a villain's face absent-mindedly and causing the man to drop like dead weight on the ground. I'm always calm, what the F do you mean? Kirishima offered a light smirk and a laugh after blinking surprisedly at the blonde's reflexes. There he is. But, you too, shitty hair, he shouted, turning once he sensed people nearing them. You're cool too, Baku bro, Kirishima replied with a grin, pressing his back against Katsuki's as villains began to crowd around them. This is temporary, Katsuki reminded himself when he began to feel a little too happy. After this, I'll never speak to this dumbass again. Just get through this. Though that didn't mean he couldn't spark a little bit of a rivalry. Yeah, whatever, fucker. Just prove to me that you aren't some lame little bug, all right? Kirishima smiled with his weird but shark teeth, and activated his quirk in his hands while Katsuki did the same. You bet. All right, fuckers. Katsuki yelled, grinning maliciously at the villains around them. Let's go. The group that was left behind was admittedly having difficulties. While the rest of their classmates fended well against the minor villains, and, unbeknownst to them, most groups already had plans and were almost ready to head back over themselves, they were all stuck with a deadlier foe. "Get back!" 13 shouted, moving to the front of the crowd. "Class rep," she turned towards her, voice stern, "you leave. Run to UA and get the rest of the staff." The boy's eyes widened in surprise. "But what about you? I can't leave all of you to fend for yourselves. It'd be cowardly, disgraceful even." "Ida," Shoji said, holding a fighting stance. "Go. We'll be fine. We need backup, you're not just leaving us." "But Dash." "Come on, class rep," Zero called out. "Listen to him." He tossed the boy a grin and a thumbs up. "We'll be all right." "While I appreciate the sentiment," Kurogyri chuckled, "is it really so wise to be discussing your plan in front of the enemy? It won't matter when we're done with you." 13 called out, unleashing her quirk. The purplish smoke was quickly essing into the black holes in her fingertips, and it almost seemed as if they might make it through easily enough. Until it didn't. With another dark laugh from Kurogyri, a portal was suddenly teleported behind 13 before she could even react. She cried out in pain as the back of her suit began to tear, unable to deactivate her quirk as her body peeled away from her. 13. Mina gasped, rushing over. The pro in question was barely able to stand, only held up by the force of the black hole. Still, she forced herself to click the caps on her fingertips back down before falling to the ground. Sorry." While Mina bent down next to the space hero to ensure that she was all right, Uraraka turned towards Ida, a determined look in her eye. "Come on, Ida. Only you can do this." And after a moment's hesitation, Ida's eyes gained the same determined glint and he activated his quirk, rushing towards the gate. "Not so fast," Kurogyri said lowly, attempting to block the boy. Ida's eyes widened when he realized he was going too fast to stop, only for Shoji to grab the villain by the metallic collar that was around his neck, throwing him to the side. "Go, Ida," the boy called out, and he continued running with a nod. Before Kurogyri could make another attempt, Zero pulled him backwards with his tape, offering another grin of encouragement. The villain seemed to quickly tire of the situation, and he forced himself upwards, rushing towards Ida in a growing cloud of smoke while Zero and Shoji were knocked down. Ida simply gritted his teeth, slamming against the door and attempting to pry it open while his heart hammered against his ribcage. Come on. Just as Kurogyri was about to reach the boy, Uraraka leapt into the air and pressed her fingertips against the metal, floating him into the air. "Go, she called out, and with that, the boy threw open the door and sped away, leaving the villain in his dust. Pressing his foot against the ground and narrowing his eyes, he paused for only the briefest of moments in order to call upon his special move. "Recipro! Burst!" he shouted, flying down the street in a flash of silver while a blue fire trailed behind him. He was going to get his classmates' help. There was no way he'd let them down.